The story begins as Cyan recalls the words his father always imparted to him. Dedicate your life to uphold the honor of the family name. Those words had always echoed in Cyan's mind, a constant reminder of his place in the world. What his father meant by them was clear. Cyan's sole purpose was to serve his older brother, to remain at his side like a shadow, without ambition or desire of his own. It was a role Cyan had long accepted, though the weight of it never quite left him. Now, in the chaos of the battlefield, the memory resurfaces. Surrounded by knights in white capes, swords drawn, Cyan crumples to his knees. His shoulders sag under the heavy burden of his thoughts, and his head hangs low, his hair falling over his face, hiding the torment behind his eyes. As several knights closed in around him, the sound of footsteps rang out across the battlefield. An unknown figure appeared, radiating an air of condescension, an arrogance too grand to be witnessed by just anyone. Cyan remained silent, blood trickling down his cheeks and pooling at the corner of his lips. His eyes remained hidden, obscured by the dark curtain of his hair. Cyan, a lone knight, stood resolute against the continent's fiercest warriors. The battlefield was littered with fallen knights, some barely able to rise. One knight gritted his teeth in frustration, clutching his wounded arm as blood stained the ground and the unconscious lay scattered across the field. Amidst the chaos, one man remained untouched. His knight's robe was pristine, his hands casually tucked behind his back as he watched with a sly smile. "How marvelous. You truly are his younger brother," he said, his voice dripping with condescension as he loomed over Lord Cyan Vert. Hearing those vulgar words, Cyan finally raised his gaze to see the man in the pristine robe. With a bitter mutter, he spoke the name, Boris. Boris, the head of the Empire's Magic Society, one of the core powers behind the Empire's darkness, working alongside the Knights of Light. Despite his distaste for the man's actions, Cyan refrained from considering him a direct threat. After all, Boris had once served as his brother's right hand. But now, seeing him here, doing this, it only deepened Cyan's confusion and disdain. The battlefield fell into an eerie silence, broken only by Boris's maniacal laughter and the smug grin on his face. Then, without warning, a dark mist coiled around Cyan's hand as he conjured a short dagger. He knew, deep down, that Boris had played a part in his downfall, and the truth only fueled the rage simmering within him. The black mist swirling from the dagger began to envelop Cyan, its dark tendrils creeping over him as he slowly pushed himself to his feet. His eyes remained hidden, shrouded by the curtain of his hair, yet there was a quiet resolve in the way he moved. Boris raised his arm to shield his face as the powerful aura radiated from Cyan. He couldn't hide his disgust, muttering that Cyan's black fog was sickening. Yet, as he observed the raw power before him, a dark realization settled in. This was exactly as the rumors had described. Cyan rose to his feet, his stance unwavering and defiant, as the dark aura surged around him. The ground beneath him cracked and trembled, unable to contain the sheer force of his power, while debris swirled in the air like a violent storm. His eyes, now glowing crimson, gleamed with deadly intent. Cyan was no mere warrior. He was an assassin of the mist. Unable to suppress his unease, Boris remarked that this mist truly was a fog, one that cast a shadow over their order of light. As the dark mist slowly encroached upon him, he realized with a sense of urgency that he needed to report back, claiming that he had eliminated the heretical rebel. Dried blood stained Cyan's face as he dropped into an offensive stance, his body coiled and ready to strike. He dared Boris to speak of his powers to the Order of Light. With a threatening sneer, he spat that Boris could try, if he still had a mouth left to speak. Boris shifted into a defensive stance, though his smug smile faltered as sweat betrayed his unease. He warned Cyan that if he intended to use his secret technique, it would be pointless. With a cold smirk, he revealed, "A 9th star magic barrier has been cast around this area. You're trapped." In his mind, Cyan knew he had to escape and expose the true culprit to his brother. As he continued to channel more mana, the air around him thickened with power. Boris stood frozen, his eyes widening as he watched Cyan's strength surge. With a fierce glare, Cyan raised his dagger to his face, preparing to strike. His voice was calm but unwavering as he declared, "I'll pierce through this barrier." Suddenly, the thick tension in the air was broken as a man clad in gleaming gold and silver armor strode past Boris. Without hesitation, Boris stepped aside, his smug demeanor vanishing. Bowing deeply, he placed a hand over his chest in deference to the imposing figure. Cyan's focused demeanor faltered as his gaze locked onto the approaching figure. His eyes widened in confusion. This was no stranger. The man's presence tugged at memories buried deep within Cyan's mind, accompanied by the echo of his father's words. "Dedicate your life to upholding the honor of the family name. Your brother Ashel is the family's pride. His success is your success." The man in golden and silver armor stood tall, his blonde hair catching the light, his expression utterly devoid of emotion. Ashel's piercing gaze settled on Cyan, his eyes narrowing as if dissecting every detail, every flaw of his younger brother. Cyan's mind churned, the shocking revelation leaving his legs unsteady. The truth was unbearable. The man behind the attack was none other than his brother, Ashel. He couldn't bring himself to believe it. Ashel continued his slow, deliberate approach, his presence towering like a colossus in the radiant golden and silver armor that gleamed with authority. In his hand, a golden sword glimmered faintly, its aura casting an almost ethereal glow, amplifying the weight of his approach. The sight of his brother standing against him drained the strength from Cyan's legs, sending him collapsing to the ground. The dark aura that had once surrounded him dissipated in an instant, leaving only a hollow silence. Ashel, his voice devoid of emotion, stared down at his brother's pitiful state. His cold, chilling tone cut through the air as he remarked, "I see it in your eyes. You don't understand why I'm here." Ashel stood just a few feet away, his towering presence casting a shadow over Cyan, making him appear small and powerless by comparison. Cyan slowly lifted his gaze, his voice unsteady as he asked, "What is the meaning of this?" Ashel's face remained an unfeeling mask, his voice chillingly calm as he responded, "You've served your purpose well, for the clan, for the people, and for me." The weight of those words struck Cyan like a blow, sinking deep into his chest. In that instant, the truth became undeniable. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Ashel understood all too well that for decades, Cyan had borne the heavy burden of his duty. Now he had come to relieve Cyan of that weight. But before he could act, Cyan's dark aura ignited once more, surging with an intensity that filled the air. The oppressive energy caught Ashel off guard, and for the first time, the cold detachment in his expression cracked, giving way to a flicker of surprise. Cyan tightened his grip on the hilt of his dagger as the dark aura around him pulsed with renewed intensity. Confusion and anguish swirled within him. His voice, trembling with desperation, broke the tense silence. "Did I do something wrong?" Ashel's eyes narrowed as he repeated Cyan's question, his tone sharp and unforgiving. Regaining his composure, he spoke coldly. "The sinister fog enveloping you tells me everything I need to know. You are no longer human, Cyan. You're nothing more than a vile murderer." Cyan lowered his head, unable to meet his brother's gaze. Ashel's words struck him like a blade, cutting deeper than any wound. He remained silent, the weight of his brother's condemnation pressing down on him. Ashel's voice rose with fury as he continued, his tone sharp and accusatory. "You've been deceiving everyone, Cyan." Anger flared as he pointed an accusing finger at him. "Do you truly claim not to know the heinous sins you're guilty of?" Cyan's expression darkened, his brother's cruel words echoing relentlessly in his mind. Murderer? Heinous crimes? His face twisted in anger, the fury boiling over. "How dare you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. The accusation burned deeper as memories surfaced. Someone else had once said something similar, that a life spent serving others was the most futile existence of all. But Cyan had rejected that notion and devoted himself entirely to a shell. Through his sacrifices, he had helped his brother achieve everything. The struggle for the imperial throne, the suppression of the demon army, the war for continental unification, and more. He had stood as a hero, a savior, the sole protector of the continent, all for a shell. To Cyan, he had been everything his brother needed and more. And now, with those bitter accusations ringing in his ears, the question clawed at him. Was it all truly futile? Cyan's fist slammed into the ground with a brutal force, his anger radiating through his entire being. He could feel the earth tremble beneath his strike, but it did nothing to quell the storm inside him. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his body trembling with fury as he realized the cold truth. His shell was abandoning him. The dark aura that had simmered within him began to ooze from his body, thick and suffocating, swirling around him like a living thing. His rage fueled it, and as the fog grew denser, it became a tangible manifestation of his hurt and betrayal. For 20 years, he had toiled like a servant under a shell, doing everything to ensure his brother's success, believing that his efforts were for the greater good. Now, that same brother stood before him as his enemy. Blood began to pool at Cyan's feet, trickling down from wounds he hadn't even noticed. But he didn't care. His body, torn and broken, was nothing. He had decided he would give everything he had, even if it meant destroying a shell in the process. The crimson mist erupted from him, engulfing the entire area in a sea of red. The sky above seemed to bleed as the fog painted it with the color of fury. The knights watching in stunned silence were paralyzed, their eyes wide with disbelief. They couldn't fathom that Cyan still had this much power left in him, as if the very essence of his being was a force they could no longer control. It was impossible. No human could wield such power, the knights thought bitterly. The hero, the man he once admired, was now trying to kill his own younger brother out of sheer fear. His voice rang out in a harsh, accusing tone as he asked, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself, Ishel?" The words struck deep, and Ishel's face contorted with fury. Veins popped along his temples, a visible sign of his growing rage. Without warning, Cyan launched himself forward with astonishing speed, a blur of motion as he relentlessly assaulted his brother. Ishel fought back, desperately swinging his sword in an attempt to deflect each strike. But Cyan wasn't looking for a battle of endurance. He was waiting for one moment, one single opportunity. Just once, that was all he needed, to find Ishel's weak spot and pierce it, stopping his brother from regenerating. The fight raged on, Cyan's body moving with precision, his every attack calculated. He could feel it. This was the moment. But as his blade rushed forward, it collided with an invisible force, a magic barrier. Cyan skidded to a halt, shock coursing through him. He hadn't expected his strongest strike to be blocked so easily. His eyes scanned the battlefield, and that's when he saw it. Boris, standing at Ishel's side, his magic fueling the barrier. Ishel sneered at him, his voice dripping with disdain. "You poor bastard," he muttered coldly, as if Cyan's struggle were beneath him. Ishel's sword plunged into Cyan's stomach, and with a sickening twist, it made Cyan's grip on his dagger falter, the weapon falling from his hand. The pain seared through him, but it was nothing compared to the cold words that followed. "I wanted to offer you a painless death, Cyan, since you're my brother," Ishel said, his voice chilling. "But you've shown me your true nature." He paused, his eyes hardening as he continued. "I knew from the start that you were a demon. It's a good thing I never trusted you." Cyan's face fell, the weight of Ishel's betrayal sinking deep into his heart. His chest tightened, and the pain from the wound became a distant ache compared to the raw agony in his soul. He had devoted his life to this man, his brother, only to be cast aside so easily. With a callous sneer, Ishel kicked Cyan aside, twisting the sword deeper to remove it from his body. The movement was cruelly deliberate, and Cyan collapsed to the ground, his blood pooling beneath him. Ashel turned away without a second glance, leaving Cyan broken and bleeding, alone in the silence of his betrayal. As Cyan lay there, blood pooling around him, he couldn't help but reflect on how foolish his life had been. The years spent in servitude, the endless sacrifices for a brother who now cast him aside. It all seemed so pointless. His mind grew fuzzy, and as darkness crept in, he called himself stupid for ever believing in Ashel. But then, a surge of adrenaline shot through him. With what little strength he had left, Cyan pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling with pain, but his resolve hardening. He chased after Ashel's retreating figure, driven by a final, desperate instinct. Ashel turned as he sensed Cyan's movement, but it was too late. Cyan's hand shot out, his dagger aimed directly at his brother's throat. A scream tore from his lungs as he poured all of his remaining power into that single lethal strike. The blade was mere inches from Ashel's throat when a sudden, overwhelming force sent Cyan flying backward. His body crashed to the ground, and the world around him blurred into darkness. When he awoke, he was gasping for air, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The sound of a voice calling young Master Cyan snapped him back to reality. He blinked, disoriented, and realized he was back in his bed. The maid was standing by his side, frowning. "You're late, young master." "Sleeping in again," she scolded. The reality of the moment hit him like a wave. Had it all been a dream? The maid's voice snapped him back to the present, her tone sharp as she told him to get his act together and prepare himself. He blinked in confusion, his mind still reeling from the dream, or nightmare, he couldn't tell. When he looked up, he was startled to see Emily standing before him. "What are you doing here?" Cyan asked, his voice betraying his surprise. Emily seemed just as taken aback, her eyes wide. But then, a realization struck him like a sudden jolt. It had been 20 years since he last saw her, yet she hadn't changed at all. She still looked the same, as though no time had passed. His gaze wandered, and that's when it hit him. Everything around him was exactly as he remembered. The room, the furniture, even the arrangement of it all, was the same as when he was a child. For a brief, disorienting moment, he wondered if he had somehow returned to his younger self, to a time before everything went wrong. "Are you stalling, Cyan?" Emily's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and teasing. "Do you not want to go to training?" She gave him a pointed look, clearly expecting an answer. Emily's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts as she instructed him to make up his mind and get moving. Cyan blinked at her, utterly bewildered. "Training? What training are you talking about?" he asked, his tone edged with uncertainty. Her brows furrowed at his question, and for a moment, she looked as if she might scold him again. But Cyan barely noticed her reaction. His gaze wandered around the room, and the realization sank deeper. This was the Vert clan duchy of the past. A chill ran down his spine. Was this what people meant when they said your life flashes before your eyes before death? Was he reliving a fragment of his memories in his final moments? The scene around him began to stir long-buried recollections. It was 27 years ago, during the Foundation year 985, on March 1st. That year marked the annual dual training session held by the duchy, a significant event that gathered attention from the entire household. His father, Duke Vert, always attended, making it an occasion of great importance. Cyan's opponent in that training session had been Kranz Vert, his half-brother. The memory sharpened, and he could see Kranz clearly in his mind's eye, a boy his own age, brimming with determination and skill. Kranz was the son of Margaret Argaeus, the Duke's wife and the Duchess of Vert. The rivalry between them, fueled by their respective positions within the family, had begun long before this particular day, but it was this duel that had set the tone for years to come. Because of that duel, Kranz had garnered far more attention than Cyan, despite both being the youngest in the family. The difference was stark. Cyan was the bastard son, a child born outside the Duke's official marriage. The humiliation of that fight cemented his position as an object of ridicule among the household and beyond. Even worse, it was after that very duel that his father ceased paying him any meaningful attention. Cyan had become invisible, overshadowed by his half-brother's growing prestige. In the present moment, Emily leaned closer and whispered softly, "Perhaps you should surrender." The words struck a nerve. Young Cyan had shaken his head then, brushing her suggestion aside. "It's okay," he had said with forced confidence. "I just need to win." But deep down, her words had stung. To Cyan, it felt as though even she doubted him, as though she too thought he was destined to fail. He adjusted his grip on the rapier in his hand. Something felt off. The weapon was heavy, far heavier than he remembered it being. That's when it hit him. His strength, his agility, even the way his body moved. It was the same as it had been back then, in his younger years. A creeping sense of unease settled over him. This didn't feel like a dream, nor a memory playing out as his life flashed before his eyes. The sensations were too vivid, the weight of the weapon too real. Whatever this was, it felt tangible, as if he had truly gone back to that time. Cyan's thoughts raced. He couldn't recall any magic spell capable of producing illusions this vivid, this real. The air felt heavy with anticipation, the murmurs of the gathered crowd tangible in his ears. He couldn't shake the possibility. Was he truly back in the past? A familiar voice cut through his musings. "Surprised you didn't run off this time," Kranz sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. Cyan's gaze flickered toward his half-brother, standing confidently with his sword at the ready. The taunt didn't sting as it once might have. Instead, it sparked something deeper in him, a realization. If this truly was the past, then maybe this was his chance to change the future. His father's voice boomed across the field, declaring the start of the match. The crowd fell silent, their focus narrowing on the two young competitors. Kranz wasted no time, lunging forward with confidence. "Where are you looking?" he jeered, his blade aimed directly at Cyan. His movements were bold and aggressive, but to Cyan, they seemed almost sluggish. He couldn't help but smirk inwardly. Kranz was like a snail in his eyes. Cyan adjusted his stance ever so slightly, shifting his weight with practiced ease. As Kranz's sword arced toward him, Cyan took a single step to the side, the movement precise and fluid. Kranz's blade swished harmlessly through the air, the momentum of his strike carrying him off balance. His eyes widened in shock as he realized he had missed. The crowd murmured in surprise, but Cyan didn't even flinch. He simply watched Kranz, his mind already calculating his next move. Kranz's frustration boiled over, his face twisting with anger. "Dodging like a coward, are you?" he spat, his voice trembling with indignation. But before he could make another move, Cyan struck. With a quick, precise motion, he hit Kranz's hand, sending his sword flying through the air. The clatter of metal on stone echoed across the field, drawing gasps from the onlookers. Cyan didn't stop there. He followed up with a swift kick to Kranz's shin, the force of the blow sending his half-brother crumpling to the ground. Kranz groaned in pain, clutching his knees and writhing on the dirt. His mother's panicked voice broke through the tension. "Kranz!" she cried, her worry palpable as she leaned forward in alarm. Cyan's gaze remained cold and unyielding as he watched the scene unfold. His thoughts raced, his grip tightening on the hilt of his rapier. Now, he thought, if I put my sword to his throat, the duel is over. It would be the simple and honorable thing to do. But something held him back. His chest burned with old memories, raw and unforgotten. He recalled the years of torment Kranz had inflicted on him, how his half-brother's cruel bullying had been a daily ordeal, a twisted form of amusement that extended even into their academy days. Cyan's resolve hardened. No, this isn't enough, he thought bitterly. If I don't break him here and now, he'll never stop. His eyes darkened as he raised his blade, determination surging through him. I'll make sure he never dares to humiliate me again. Cyan had resolved that in this life, he would carve his own path, free from the shadows of others. His determination had been made clear in the duel's outcome. Across the field, Kranz lay trembling, his face streaked with tears, his pride shattered along with his composure. The verdict was undeniable. Kranz had lost. Shortly after, the Duke summoned Cyan to his study, even clearing his schedule for the meeting. This unexpected gesture left Cyan curious. Was my victory really that significant? He wondered. A high-ranking knight named Jurkin, one of the Duke's personal retainers, was tasked with escorting him. As they made their way through the grand halls of the Vert estate, Cyan encountered Margaret Argaeus, Kranz's mother. Her face was stormy, her frustration palpable. It seemed she had just come from a heated discussion with the Duke about her son's humiliating defeat. Cyan couldn't resist. A sly grin tugged at his lips as he approached her. "Lady Margaret," he said, feigning innocence, "is Kranz all right?" Her fury flared instantly. She turned on him, her voice sharp and cutting. "How dare you ask me that?" she snapped, her tone venomous. "After the disgraceful way you humiliated your brother, you've got the audacity to ask if he's all right?" As Cyan walked away, Margaret Argaeus's voice followed him, sharp and venomous. "Thick-skinned, aren't you?" she sneered, brushing past him. "But I suppose that's just how duels are." Her words carried a deliberate sting, each syllable dripping with disdain. Then she muttered, loud enough for him to hear, "This is why bastards shouldn't be treated like legitimate children." Cyan paused mid-step, his back stiffening. Margaret wasn't done. With a devilish grin, she added, "Like mother, like son. Your mother was nothing more than a dirty whore, after all." The insult burned in his ears, but before he could respond, she twisted the knife further. "You should be out on the streets, begging for scraps, not standing here daring to act as though you belong. You should have known better than to put up a fight. You should have been grateful." Cyan turned slowly, his gaze locking onto hers with a cold, murderous intensity. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His crimson eyes glowed faintly, a grim expression settling on his face as dark thoughts swirled in his mind. For a fleeting moment, Cyan weighed the idea of silencing Margaret's vile tongue permanently. He knew precisely how to make her suffer, slowly, meticulously, ensuring every ounce of pain was felt. The thought alone brought a chilling calm to his storming mind. Instead, he tilted his head, his voice sharp and mocking as he asked, "Are you aware that I'll be attending the academy with Kranz, Duchess?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And what of it?" she snapped, her tone laced with suspicion. Cyan's smile was anything but kind. "I'm sure you'd want your precious son to graduate intact, with all his limbs, perhaps? Or maybe you're not as concerned about him as you claim. Is that it, Duchess?" Her fury erupted like a firestorm. "You vulgar piece of filth!" she spat, raising her hand to slap him. Before her palm could connect, a strong arm intercepted the blow. Jurkin, the high-class knight escorting Cyan, stepped in with an unwavering expression. "My apologies, Duchess," he said firmly, lowering her hand with calculated restraint. "The Duke has called for young Master Cyan urgently. We mustn't delay." Margaret's face twisted with rage, but she said nothing. The Duke's orders were absolute. Cyan peeked from behind Jurkin's imposing figure, a sly grin curling his lips. He was being shielded by one of the most steadfast knights in the duchy, a man who wouldn't bow even to the Duke's wife. Jurkin was a fortress, unyielding and reliable, and in that moment, Cyan found himself appreciating the knight's silent strength. The heavy doors creaked open. His authoritative voice resonated through the chamber. "Come in." Cyan stepped forward, his small frame straightening instinctively as he entered the room. He greeted the Duke respectfully, his tone steady despite the swirl of emotions beneath his composed exterior. As he stood there, memories surfaced. Memories of how long it had been since they last spoke alone. Nearly 15 years. 15 years since he had stood in the presence of this man, without the buffer of others. Duke Williers Vert was no ordinary noble. He was the formidable ruler of Velius, a western stronghold of the Wusif Empire. Yet the world knew him by a far greater title, the Guardian of the Continent. He was a legend, a hero who had held back the tides of demonic invasions with unmatched magical prowess and unparalleled wisdom. Duke Williers Vert bore a burden no one demanded of him, a responsibility he carried until his final breath on the battlefield against the Demon King's army. His singular wish was for peace to reign across the continent. But for Cyan, his memories of the Duke were far less noble. To him, this was a man who chose, of his own free will, to spend his entire life in servitude to ideals and others. A man who embraced that life willingly, never seeking more for himself. To Cyan, he was a fool. The Duke's deep voice broke the silence, pulling Cyan from his thoughts. Your eyes followed the sword precisely, tracking its path before you dodged. Cyan blinked, momentarily confused. The Duke elaborated, his tone analytical. When Kranz charged at you, you didn't flinch. You looked directly at the arc of the blade and turned your body to avoid it perfectly. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on Cyan. So tell me, when did you learn to wield a sword? Cyan recognized that, as always, the Duke's perception was razor sharp. Choosing his words carefully, he answered, I wouldn't say I learned it. I practiced on my own, every night. The Duke's eyes narrowed. Practiced? On your own? You've never shown any interest in swordsmanship before. Why hide such remarkable skill? Heat crept into Cyan's cheeks. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, he admitted, though the excuse felt flimsy under the Duke's intense scrutiny. The Duke tilted his head slightly, unconvinced. An odd claim, considering you went all out to take down Kranz in that duel. His voice carried a note of challenge as he added, Tell me, Cyan, do you believe what you did afterward was necessary? Cyan tensed. The Duke was undoubtedly referring to the moment he struck Kranz while he was already down. The question carried a deliberate weight, as if the Duke were probing for a deeper truth. Cyan hesitated briefly before replying, I wanted to prove myself. The Duke leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. Prove what, exactly? With steady conviction, Cyan met his father's eyes. That I'm better than Kranz, even though we share the same blood. That I can rise above him. The room was silent for a beat, save for the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Then, unexpectedly, the Duke chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that filled the space. Well said, the Duke remarked, his expression softening into something resembling approval. A clear and concise answer, showing both confidence and level-headedness. I didn't realize you were this capable, Cyan. The Duke's delight was palpable as he added, You'll make a fine and reliable support for a shell one day. Those words hit Cyan like a cold blade. The betrayal of his past life surged through his chest, an ache he struggled to suppress. In that moment, he realized that even in this second chance, his father's praise wasn't for him. It was for what he could offer to a shell. His grip on the present wavered, but he masked his emotions, knowing this was only the beginning. Cyan's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disappointment. He couldn't fathom why the Duke would suggest he become a shell's assistant, yet again. It was always the same. The Duke, with his unwavering obsession, had never truly seen Cyan for who he was, only as an extension of his shell's ambitions. His clenched fists betrayed his simmering frustration. The Duke, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing within Cyan, smiled and offered, I want to reward you, Cyan. If there's anything you desire, anything at all, you need only ask. Cyan's eyes hardened as he locked onto the Duke, a cold resolve settling in his chest. He had heard enough. Everything a shell had worked for, everything he had strived to build, Cyan would tear it all down. I want to go to the battlefront, he declared, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable intensity. A few moments later, Emily entered the room. Upon hearing Cyan's request, her face drained of color, her shock evident. You want to go to the battlefront? She repeated, her voice trembling slightly. Cyan met her gaze, his expression resolute. Nothing is certain yet. Emily's concern deepened as she pressed further. Are you out of your mind? Do you even understand what kind of place that is? She warned him, her voice laced with concern, that the battlefront was infested with wicked, terrifying demonic beasts, creatures that roamed freely across the land. Velius, the western feud of the Wusif Empire, was the only place on the entire continent truly deserving of the title Battlefront. And within that, the Lamaya Valley stood as the ultimate front line, a blood-soaked battlefield where the war against demons had raged for centuries. The Duke, ever the stubborn man, had opposed sending anyone to that cursed place from the start. Yet, in his own way, he'd offered Cyan a condition, one that would grant him a chance to enter Lamaya Valley. He must prove himself worthy within 1 month. Cyan had no idea what standards the Duke would use to judge him, but he knew one thing. If he wanted to step foot on that hellish ground, he had to strengthen himself as much as possible in the time given. He was well aware of his own shortcomings. Despite his combat sense being sharper than most, his body was still weaker than that of his peers. But there was a glimmer of hope. The magic he'd once possessed stirred faintly within him, and that, coupled with the battle instincts that had followed him from his past life, could make all the difference. His plan was simple: train his body to its fullest potential, and he would use whatever advantages he had. Without wasting any more time, he resolved to begin his training immediately. Suddenly, the door to his room burst open with force. A woman stormed in, her presence commanding attention. It was Ellis, her blue hair and stern expression marking her as someone not easily intimidated. Without a word, she grabbed him by the collar, shaking him as if he were a rag doll. "Have you lost your mind?" she snapped, her voice cold and furious. Emily, appearing startled but composed, greeted Lady Ellis with respect. But Ellis paid her little attention, her focus entirely on Cyan as she shook him once more, demanding an explanation for his reckless behavior. Ellis had heard the rumors, how Cyan had asked their father to send him to the battlefront. She released him with a sharp shove, leaving him to crumble to the ground, his body feeling heavier than ever. It was as if his very soul had left him, drained by the weight of Ellis's gaze. "You think defeating Kranz has made you invincible?" Ellis's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. "Get up. We're going to the rooftop." Cyan barely processed her words as he pushed himself to his feet. The world seemed to blur around him, his mind still spinning from the chaotic events of the day. On the rooftop, Ellis wasted no time. Her eyes were cold, calculating. "Here's the deal," she began, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'll allow you to go to the battlefront, but only if you can endure my attacks for 3 minutes once we draw our swords." Cyan blinked in surprise. "Do we really need to go that far?" His voice was laced with confusion, unsure whether to laugh or be infuriated by the challenge. Ellis's expression hardened. "Yes, we do." Her eyes locked with his, unyielding. "Answer me truthfully. Are you after the family's title?" Internally, Cyan was taken aback. He hadn't considered that Ellis's actions were driven by such a motive, the title. He wasn't interested in it, not even the slightest bit. Yet her assumption, combined with her cold tone, made it clear that she saw this as the only reason behind his actions. His silence was all the confirmation Ellis needed. She turned, gesturing for him to draw his sword. Cyan felt a sigh build up in his chest as he unsheathed his blade. This had been a day of nothing but chaos. It hadn't even been half a day since his duel with Kranz, and now he was expected to fight Ellis? He shook his head in frustration. "What a mess this day has turned out to be," he muttered to himself, preparing for whatever Ellis was about to throw at him. Ellis launched her attack without hesitation, catching Cyan off guard. But to her surprise, he managed to block her strike, something that should have been impossible for a 10-year-old. Ellis took a step back, her mind racing to process what had just happened. A rapier was a light weapon, designed for quick, precise strikes, not for blocking the heavy blow of a longsword. Yet somehow, Cyan had parried it cleanly. She paused, wondering if it had just been a stroke of luck. But the determination in his eyes told her otherwise. "You've got better instincts than I gave you credit for," she muttered, analyzing his form. Cyan could see from Ellis's sharp gaze that the situation was about to escalate. He had only bought himself a brief moment of respite. Without warning, Ellis pressed forward, her attacks coming faster and harder than before. Cyan stood his ground, meeting each blow with calculated precision. He parried her sword again, this time positioning his rapier with a quick flick that surprised them both, the blade parallel to her throat. Ellis froze for a split second, caught off guard by the unexpected turn of events. But before Cyan could capitalize on the opportunity, he felt the force of her next strike. With a burst of energy, she blasted him back, sending him flying into the air. He landed hard on top of a nearby pillar, gasping for breath. The world spun around him, his heart racing. His thoughts were chaotic. Had he not adjusted his grip on the sword midway through the strike, he would have ended the fight right then and there. But now, he was left with nothing but a sense of impending danger. The battle could still go terribly wrong. He landed hard on top of a nearby pillar, gasping for breath. The world spun around him, his heart racing. His thoughts were chaotic. Had he not adjusted his grip on the sword midway through the strike, he would have ended the fight right then and there. But now, he was left with nothing but a sense of impending danger. The battle could still go terribly wrong. Mist's swordsmanship, known as thick fog, was designed for one purpose: to land a killing blow. Cyan couldn't help but acknowledge the truth. Fighting without the intent to kill was becoming increasingly difficult, especially with his limited strength. His body ached from exertion, and though he was compensating for his lack of physical power by imbuing his rapier with mana, he could feel his energy waning. He wondered how much longer he could hold on before his strength gave out completely. Ellis was in no better state, her breath coming in ragged, labored gasps. She lowered her head, her blue hair falling in heavy bangs that obscured her eyes. But then, with a quiet determination, Ellis began to chant, summoning the power of the earth and the wind. Cyan's eyes widened as his sister's chants reached his ears. A surge of fear crossed his face, and he swallowed hard. His gaze snapped to Ellis. She was invoking a level 6 spell. In the blink of an eye, Ellis dropped into an offensive stance, one eye glowing with a piercing blue aura, her target locked in her gaze. The elements swirled around her dull sword, which began to shimmer with an ethereal, vibrant blue light. It was the high-level magic known as Aqua Blade. The sight of the magical blade only intensified Cyan's sense of looming doom. A wry, almost nervous expression crossed his face as he realized this was meant to be a test. He couldn't help but wonder, was Ellis truly planning to kill him? Ellis lost all composure, any semblance of reason vanishing in an instant. Her sole focus was the fear of defeat. Over and over, she murmured to herself, "I won't lose." Cyan could sense the grimness of the situation, realizing how dire it had become for him. Her eyes burned with an intense glow, clouding her judgment with a singular, dangerous determination. Cyan knew from the fierce glint in her eyes that this could very well be the end. His position on the edge of the pillar left little room for error. Even if he managed to block her attack, he was sure he'd be sent tumbling off. But he had a plan, one that was as risky as it was desperate. Trusting his instincts, he decided to act first. In a flash of speed, Cyan charged at her, closing the distance in an instant. Ellis, sensing his approach, thrust her sword toward the sky, channeling all her power into the blade. With a surge of blue mana, the sword erupted in a burst of energy, preparing for a devastating strike. Cyan knew this would be his only chance. If he could reach her before she fully unleashed her magic, he might just have a shot at surviving this encounter. Cyan gripped his sword tightly, his heart pounding in his chest as he silently begged for someone, anyone, to intervene. He could feel Ellis's power radiating from her, a force so intense it seemed to weigh down on him. Desperation filled Cyan as he silently prayed for Jurken's arrival, hoping he would intervene before the inevitable clash. As if answering his unspoken plea, a commanding shout echoed through the air. "Stop!" Just as Ellis and Cyan were about to collide, Jurkin appeared, leaping into the fray with his hand firmly gripping the hilt of his sword. With blinding speed, Jurkin intercepted Ellis's strike, his unsheathed sword meeting hers in a clash that erupted with a burst of blue energy. The air quaked as shock waves rippled outward, the sharp ring of metal against metal echoing through the field. Despite the explosive collision, Jurkin stood unmoved, his stance unyielding like a fortress. Without hesitation, he reached out and grabbed Cyan by the back of his neck, lifting him effortlessly off the ground as though the boy weighed nothing. His stern expression cut through the chaos as his piercing gaze locked onto Ellis. "Lady Ellis," he said, his voice steady, yet edged with authority. "You've gone too far. This was a test, not a battle to the death." His tone was firm, commanding respect, but beneath the discipline was a thread of concern. He chastised her, not merely as a superior, but as someone who cared. His words both a reprimand and a reminder of the line she had crossed. Dangling helplessly from Jurkin's grip, Cyan let out a long sigh of relief, his chest heaving as the tension slowly ebbed away. His mind raced, replaying the nerve-wracking moments when he had doubted whether Jurkin would ever arrive. For a fleeting, agonizing instant, he had believed he was utterly alone. Ellis gasped, as if snapping out of a trance, her eyes widening in dawning realization. Her mouth fell open as she took in the sight before her. Jurkin's unsheathed sword holding her blade at bay. The glow of mana around her weapon dimmed and faded, leaving her stunned and speechless. Without a word, Ellis rushed to Cyan, pulling him into a trembling embrace. Her arms quivered as she clung to him, her voice breaking with guilt-laden apologies. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her words spilling out in shaky, incoherent fragments. Tears brimmed in her eyes before spilling over, streaking down her face. Ellis's grip tightened unconsciously, drawing a strangled cough from Cyan. "Ellis, I can't breathe," he managed to croak. But she didn't let go. Her emotions poured out in a flood as her tears turned into sobs. Snot bubbled from her nose, yet she paid no mind to her disheveled state. Jurkin stood nearby, watching the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. He made no move to interrupt, his neutral gaze betraying neither approval nor reproach as Ellis's raw emotions poured forth, unrestrained. "I just couldn't stand it," she cried, her voice cracking. "The thought of you going to the front lines, I couldn't bear it. I didn't know what I was doing. I lost control." Her words tumbled out between gasping sobs as she buried her face against him, clutching him as though letting go would shatter her world. Cyan smiled softly, touched by her outburst. He could never deny how much Ellis cared, always pouring herself fully into everything she did. Her determination, even when it caused her to break down, was something he could always count on. It was just like her. Cyan's older sister, Ellis, was the embodiment of excellence, an elite among elites. At the academy, renowned across the continent as the pinnacle of training in swordsmanship, magic, and academics, Ellis stood unrivaled. Among the most talented students, she reigned as an unmatched S-class prodigy, excelling effortlessly in every discipline. But Ellis's brilliance wasn't limited to her skills. Her beauty was as striking as her talent, earning her the title Godchild. Her long, flowing blue hair, partially braided, framed a face of flawless elegance, and her smile, radiant and warm, could brighten an entire room, leaving those around her captivated. From a young age, she was rigorously trained in the art of swordsmanship, and it was no surprise that many hailed her as the future guardian of the continent, alongside her older brother, Vert. Yet, despite her immense potential, her future took a tragic turn. Not long after she joined the Order of Light, she was gravely injured, keeled, as they called it, leaving her unable to fulfill her promising role. As Cyan held her in his arms, he felt a surge of emotion, the weight of missing her pressing down on him. His hug was tight, almost desperate, and it seemed to catch Ellis's attention. In that moment, he silently vowed to protect her this time, to ensure she never had to face the same fate again. Ellis, sensing the intensity of his embrace, pulled back slightly, her focus shifting. She glanced at Yurkin, her brow furrowing with confusion. "Are you the Duke's guardian knight?" she asked, surprised. "But the Duke just left for the war." Jurkin nodded, his expression serious yet gentle. "Yes, Lady Ellis. I've been given orders to protect the young master for the time being," he explained, though there was a hint of secrecy in his tone. "I cannot reveal everything, as I'm carrying out these orders in secret." Ever since he left the Duke's office, Cyan had felt a subtle presence following him. It nagged at him. Had Jurkin always been there, or had he just started trailing him? Cyan wondered why his father would have asked Jurkin to follow him in secret. The thought lingered in his mind, but it was quickly overshadowed by a wave of grogginess that overtook him without warning. Before Cyan could react, Ellis caught him just as he began to stumble, his eyelids growing heavy with exhaustion. She smiled softly, her voice gentle yet teasing. "You're still such a little kid, Cyan," she said, her tone laced with affection. The chaotic clash between siblings came to an end, giving way to a tranquil night. The cool evening air settled around them, carrying a sense of calm, while the stars above sparkled brilliantly, as if bearing silent witness to their reconciliation. The next morning, Ellis departed for the academy once more. Her visit had been brief, a fleeting stop to see their father before her graduation. Yet, in that short time, Cyan was reminded of how much he missed her presence. The emptiness she left behind only deepened his resolve. Alone in his study room, Cyan dropped to the floor and began his push-ups, his small body trembling with each repetition. For 2 weeks, he had thrown himself into rigorous strength training, determined to grow stronger. He knew he had to build himself up if he ever hoped to protect Ellis. But progress came slowly, agonizingly so. His arms burned, his chest ached, and after 10 push-ups, his strength gave out. Panting heavily, he collapsed onto the floor, frustration gnawing at him like a relentless beast. No matter how hard he pushed himself, it felt as though he'd hit an unyielding wall, unable to break through. Before his regression, Cyan had been confident in his physical strength. His body had been strong, well-defined and resilient. But now, everything felt different. His frailty, a stark reminder of how far he had to go. Silent tears streamed down his face as he wished for a fleeting moment that he could return to the past and reclaim his former self. This time, he knew he needed a new approach, a solution that would propel him beyond his current limits. As his thoughts churned, a sudden knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. He wiped his face quickly and turned toward the sound. Standing in the doorway was Emily, his maid, holding a package in her hands. Cyan rose to his feet and smiled warmly at the young maid. The package he had requested had arrived. Emily stood in the doorway, her face twisted in mild disgust as she pinched her nose with her fingers. "I hope you're happy with this," she muttered under her breath. In her hand was a small bottle, its contents unmistakable: hellhound's blood. The stench was overpowering, an odor so foul it lingered in the air, clinging to everything around it. Cyan had taken advantage of Ellis's guilt over their sparring match, asking her to send the bottle as a favor. Hellhound's blood was a rare substance, only found in the treacherous Lamia Valley. But Cyan had learned that it had also made its way into the black market, though most people avoided it. The blood of demon beasts was notoriously vile, reeking with a nauseating odor and causing a fierce, burning sensation in the mouth. With a grim expression, Cyan unscrewed the lid of the bottle. As he poured the thick, dark red liquid into a white bowl, bubbles began to form at the surface, adding to the already revolting sight. The smell intensified, filling the room with an almost suffocating stench. To most, this substance was considered a poison, deadly and volatile. What most people didn't know was that the blood of demonic beasts had the power to permanently enhance both physical and magical abilities when consumed. Though many dismissed it as a mere myth, Cyan knew better. In his previous life, he had witnessed the effects firsthand. His features darkened as he gazed at the bowl in his hands, and a sinister smile crept across his face. The knowledge of its power gave him a sense of grim satisfaction. Behind him, Emily stood, still pinching her nose in disgust, her face twisted in disbelief. "Are you really going to drink that, young master?" she wondered aloud, her voice tinged with both concern and revulsion. Cyan turned to her, his expression unwavering. "I will," he said confidently, his voice steady as he prepared to take the fateful step. Cyan reassured Emily with a calm glance, telling her not to worry as he brought the hellhound's blood to his lips. He thought to himself that if he could stomach her cooking, he could endure this foul liquid. He remembered the first dish she ever made for him, supposed to be mushroom soup. The sight of it had almost stopped his heart, and after the first spoonful, he was certain he'd never taste anything worse. Yet, compared to that, hellhound's blood wasn't so bad. In fact, he found it almost tolerable. He drank it all, his eyes narrowing in concentration. As the last drop slid down his throat, a surge of raw power rushed through his veins, and his eyes glowed a deep crimson. A sense of strength, unlike anything he'd felt before, spread through his body. He wiped the blood from his mouth, the strange new energy pulsing within him. Emily watched him from behind, her brow furrowed in disgust as she took in the scene, unable to mask her distaste for what she had just witnessed. The energy surged within him, radiating outward as every muscle and vein hummed with newfound strength. "That's good," he murmured, his voice calm and steady, despite the intensity of the sensation coursing through him. He rose to his feet, feeling the power rush through his body, a dark crimson aura swirling around him. His eyes burned with a fierce determination as he turned toward Emily. "I'm going out for a walk," he said, his gaze unwavering and resolute. Cyan wanted to test if the hellhound's blood had truly increased his strength. He stepped outside, the crisp air of the duchy filling his lungs as he made his way toward a familiar mountain overlooking the land. It had been a while since he last visited this place. For the past 2 weeks, he'd been waiting for this moment, when Yurkin was away and the usual reports were absent. It was his time to be alone, to gather his thoughts and explore. As Cyan trudged along the muddy roads of the mountain, his thoughts drifted to another matter entirely. He recalled a memory from his previous life. Ashel, his brother's closest companion, had received a divine revelation from Lumendel, the god of light. The message spoke of an ancient temple hidden deep in the backwoods of Velius. The temple's entrance was said to lie somewhere nearby, though its exact location had eluded all who searched for it. Cyan continued walking, his eyes scanning the land, searching for any clue that might lead him to it. At first, he hadn't believed the story. It had sounded like just another grand tale, another myth to add to the endless stories of gods and legends. But as he focused his senses, something shifted. He crouched down, placing a hand on the ground, and felt it. There was something here. A faint but unmistakable concentration of mana flowing through the earth beneath his fingers. In that moment, Cyan knew it was real. The entrance was close. And though he knew that in this life his brother had yet to receive the revelation, he couldn't help but feel a surge of anticipation. Cyan's expression darkened, a twisted smile spreading across his face as the whites of his teeth gleamed. His hand extended forward, and dark crimson mana surged from his fingers, swirling in the air like a living shadow. In this life, only he knew the secret hidden within the divine revelation, and that knowledge filled him with a sense of dark triumph. As his palm made contact with the ground, his aura intensified. The earth beneath his hand trembled and cracked, crumbling away as a path began to form before him. His eyes gleamed with a sinister light as he imagined how Ashel would never, in his wildest dreams, suspect what Cyan was truly plotting. Not yet, anyway. A low, ominous rumble reverberated through the air, growing louder as the earth itself began to split. With a final, violent crack, the ground shattered, revealing an underground passage, long forgotten and hidden for centuries. As Cyan descended into the dark passage, a strange sensation washed over him. The air felt heavier, thicker than he remembered, as though the energy of the place had grown more potent since the last time he'd been here. Every step made his pulse quicken, a subtle reminder that this was no ordinary place. Hands tucked casually into his pockets, Cyan's gaze wandered the dimly lit path, his mind drifting to his past life before the regression. This was an ancient temple, once devoted to Lumendel, the god of light, a sacred site now shrouded in mystery and nearly forgotten by time. Its history was a somber one. Centuries ago, during the devastating Demon War, the temple had been destroyed, its legacy erased in the chaos. The conflict left scars too deep to mend, burying not just the temple, but the memories of its divine purpose beneath layers of time and ash. As Cyan descended the long, narrow steps, his eyes caught a peculiar golden light emanating from the shrine ahead. The glow pierced through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the pathway and casting soft, flickering shadows on the ancient stone walls. His expression remained neutral, but inwardly, his thoughts churned. Who would have imagined that such a sacred site could lie hidden in the mountains right behind the castle? The realization that it had always been in his own backyard, in the secluded backwoods, was almost laughable. As he approached the radiating golden light, his gaze settled on the weapon resting within the shrine. It seemed to pulse with an ethereal brilliance, as though alive, commanding reverence with its presence. The weapon appeared less like an object and more like the temple's rightful master, a relic infused with divine power, waiting patiently for its chosen wielder. Cyan's thoughts wandered through the annals of history. It was the year 999 SC, before the dawn of the Foundation era, on a fateful August 12th, when humanity achieved its greatest victory, driving the Demon King's formidable army out of Velius. The odds had been insurmountable. The Demon King's forces, far superior in strength and strategy, seemed invincible. Yet, against all expectations, humanity prevailed. The turning point had come with the discovery of ancient relics known as the gods' weaponry. These sacred artifacts imbued their wielders with divine power, enabling them to defy the impossible. Of all the legendary relics, none was more revered than Duran Dark, the holy sword blessed by Lumendel, the god of light. This blade of celestial brilliance had become a symbol of humanity's triumph, a weapon of divine justice that cleaved through darkness and despair. But for Cyan, the sword's legacy was a bitter one. In his past life, it wasn't a symbol of salvation, but the instrument of his downfall. Wielded by a shell with righteous fervor, Duran Dark had brought his life to an end, humiliating, pitiful, and final. The memory of its gleaming edge haunted him even now, fueling his determination to rewrite the course of destiny. Cyan couldn't shake the thought that Duran Dark might somehow be tied to his inexplicable regression. The idea gnawed at him, an uneasy mix of curiosity and lingering bitterness. Unable to resist, he extended a hand toward the sword. His fingers brushed against its hilt, and as he had expected, nothing happened. No divine resonance, no surge of power. Just cold, unyielding metal. Disappointment twisted into frustration, and his irritation flared. In a petty act of defiance, Cyan kicked the tip of the blade, his voice laced with biting sarcasm as he muttered, "Holy sword, my ass." The encounter had soured his mood entirely. Whatever secrets the sword held, they seemed unwilling to reveal themselves to him. With a resigned sigh, he decided to finish what he had come for and leave this place behind. Yet, as he turned to go, the sword hummed faintly. Unbeknownst to Cyan, Duran Dark was far from indifferent to his mockery. As Cyan turned to step beyond the altar's golden glow, an unsettling shift stopped him in his tracks. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a shadow, an unnatural one that seemed to move of its own accord. At first, he assumed it was merely the sword's shadow, cast by the radiant light of the shrine. But as he looked closer, unease crept in. This wasn't an ordinary shadow. Where there is light, there must also be darkness, and this darkness was alive. A sinister red mist began to seep from the shadow's edges, twisting and curling like smoke from an unseen fire. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive force that sent shivers down Cyan's spine. Crouching down, he examined it more closely. The crimson mist carried a suffocating aura, one that could easily be mistaken for the sword's divine influence. But Cyan knew better. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, a glint of dark excitement flickering in his eyes. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones. This was no ordinary shadow. This was something deeper, something hidden within the light itself, a darkness far more fascinating than the holy radiance that tried to conceal it. Cyan placed both hands firmly on the ground where the red mist swirled, channeling his mana into the peculiar shadow. The energy flowed from him, dark and unrelenting, merging with the ominous mist. As the ground beneath him began to tremble, Cyan's thoughts turned inward, a quiet realization echoing in his mind. Where there is light, there will always be darkness, hidden in the glow of the altar. The ground responded to his mana, shifting and unraveling as if a veil had been lifted. Slowly, a hidden path revealed itself, concealed for centuries behind the radiant altar. A dimly lit doorway materialized, its presence an unspoken secret, lost to time. Cyan stepped forward, each movement deliberate, until he reached the door and pushed it open. What greeted him was a stark contrast to the divine brilliance of the outer chamber. The room was cloaked in shadow, dark and hollow, exuding an aura of foreboding. At its center stood another pedestal, this one holding a short dagger, levitating as if untouched by the weight of time. Unlike the golden glow of the divine sword, this weapon radiated a strange, otherworldly pink aura, pulsating faintly like a heartbeat. Cyan's lips curled into a pleased smile. The sight of the dagger was both familiar and exhilarating. He recognized it instantly and felt a surge of dark anticipation. Cyan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he reached out to place a hand on the crimson blade. His fingers brushed against its surface, and a wicked grin spread across his face. It had been far too long. The weapon responded instantly, its dark aura igniting in a fierce, pulsating flare. This was Kiram, the demonic sword he had wielded in his previous life, the blade that had once been an extension of his very soul. The air grew heavy as the aura surged, wild and untamed, wrapping around Cyan like a shadowy shroud. He swung the dagger a few times, slicing effortlessly through the air. The movements felt natural, instinctive, as though no time had passed since he had last held it. The weapon's power hummed in his grip, resonating with his own dark energy. As he extended the short dagger before him, a sly grin tugged at his lips. With a tone of mock cheerfulness, he greeted the blade with casual defiance, his voice laced with familiarity. "Good morning, Kiram." Cyan casually slid one hand into his pocket, his gaze fixed on the dagger in his other hand. When the blade remained silent, unresponsive, a faint frown crept across his face. Kiram must still be dormant, he thought, her power yet to stir. Tilting his head slightly, he considered his options before gripping the hilt tighter. With a deliberate motion, he began to swing the dagger through the air, each arc more forceful than the last, as if the sheer intensity might rouse her from her slumber. A warmth crept into Cyan's cheeks, a faint blush betraying the surge of emotions stirring within him. The dagger's familiar, intoxicating presence awakened a fire he had almost forgotten, a sensation that coursed through him like an unspoken craving. For the first time in this new life, he felt truly alive, his blood thrumming with a restless need to test Kiram's power. An itch began to grow, gnawing at his thoughts. He needed a target, something to unleash this rekindled strength upon. Anything would do. As Cyan basked in the moment, a shadow pooled beneath him, shifting and twisting until it formed sharp, predatory eyes that locked onto him with an unrelenting glare. From the depths of the shadow came a deep, resonant voice, dripping with menace. "You're quite the daring boy, aren't you?" it growled. "Do you even understand the price of waking me?" Cyan paused mid-swing, the dagger frozen in his grip as he met the shadow's gaze. His expression remained calm, almost indifferent, a faint trace of amusement playing on his lips. "Fear? Not exactly," he replied, his voice carrying a lazy nonchalance, as though the ominous presence before him was hardly worth his concern. With a dismissive shrug, he tilted his head slightly, his tone laced with mock confidence. "And as for the price, I'm going to assume it means this dagger is mine now." The shadow pulsed, expanding into a larger, more menacing form, its edges rippling with malice. "Ignorant fool," it hissed, its voice dripping with disdain. "You've awakened a demonic blade. Regret will do you no good now. It's far too late." As the shadow writhed, it twisted into a grotesque visage, a ghastly grin stretching across its shape, revealing jagged, razor-sharp teeth. "Your body will be mine," it snarled, before surging forward with feral intensity, a whirlwind of darkness and fury, hurtling straight towards Cyan. Before the shadow could strike, Cyan acted with unerring precision. His hand lashed out, seizing the shadow by the throat in a single, fluid motion. The creature halted mid-attack, its ferocity giving way to a stunned stillness as Cyan's grip tightened with an iron resolve. His expression remained calm, almost indifferent as he muttered, "You talk too much." For a fleeting moment, Cyan's thoughts flickered with curiosity. He didn't remember Kirim ever being this reckless. The shadow writhed and clawed at his unyielding grip, its once imposing aura flickering like a dying flame. The obsidian black exterior began to peel away, revealing a humanoid face beneath the darkness. For the first time, it wasn't Cyan who seemed taken aback, it was Kirim. The demonic blade stirred with unease as white ichor dripped from the shadow's mouth, pooling beneath them like a quiet lament. Kirim gasped, her voice laced with disbelief as she stammered, demanding to know who Cyan was. Her expression twisted with confusion, her sharp eyes darting to his hand still firmly clasped around her throat. "How can you touch me?" she hissed, her voice trembling with both anger and unease. Cyan's lips curled into a smirk, his tone calm, yet carrying an undeniable finality. "Simple, I told you, you belong to me." Kirim's eyes flared with fury as a low growl escaped her lips. Her nails extended into vicious razor-sharp claws, glinting like deadly blades. "Get lost!" she shrieked, lashing out with a sudden ferocity. The unexpected attack forced Cyan to release her grip, his fingers falling away as Kirim leaped back with a predatory elegance. Her presence radiated danger, her stance poised and ready for another strike. Despite the sudden shift, Cyan remained composed, his neutral expression unshaken, his eyes locked on hers with unwavering confidence. The shadow coalesced into a striking figure, a woman of otherworldly beauty and lethal elegance. Her movements carried a predatory grace, and an aura of danger seemed to ripple off her in waves. Kirim's sharp eyes narrowed as she studied him, her voice edged with suspicion. "Who are you?" she demanded, her elongated claws still poised for a strike, her posture tense and wary, like a cornered beast ready to pounce, her piercing gaze fixed on the dark aura swirling around him, her tone sharp and questioning. "You're shrouded in something, twisted. Are you the successor?" Her eyes narrowed further, suspicion deepening. "Why do I sense air's presence within you?" Cyan's grin widened, the gleam in his eyes unmistakably devilish. "You've hit the mark," he replied, his voice rich with unshakable confidence. "I am air's successor. Your master has returned." He stepped forward, his presence commanding as the air grew colder around him. "Now bow, Kirim. Your master has returned," he ordered, his voice carrying an icy authority that left no room for defiance. Kirim recoiled, her expression darkening as her brows twitched in defiance. Fury and disbelief mingled in her voice as she spat, "You're just a snot-nosed child." Her tone trembled, her denial palpable. "I won't accept this." With a piercing scream, she lunged at him, claws slashing through the air with wild precision. Sparks danced across the room as Cyan parried her frenzied attacks effortlessly, his every movement sharp and calculated. He sighed inwardly, realizing that words would never reach her. Of course, he mused grimly, a demonic sword exists to dominate its wielder, not serve them willingly. As Kiram unleashed another relentless strike, Cyan's lips curved into a menacing grin, his demeanor shifting to something far darker. He leapt back, creating a gap between them, his voice dropping to an ominous whisper. "All right then, let's do this your way." With a flick of his wrist, a surge of dark energy coursed through him. "Sword manipulation," he intoned, activating demonic sword control. The air around him crackled with power, the room dimming as shadows twisted and danced at his command. Kiram froze mid-strike as an unseen force dragged her to the ground with crushing intensity. A sharp groan escaped her lips as the impact reverberated through her body. Struggling against the invisible power pinning her, her sharp nails clawed at the ground, leaving deep gouges. She glared up at Cyan with gritted teeth, disbelief flickering in her furious eyes. How could this child know the ancient incantation to restrain her? Cyan stood over her, his expression cold and tinged with mockery. Despite her predicament, Kiram continued to resist, refusing to acknowledge him as her master. With unshaken resolve, Cyan called out sword manipulation once more. The force intensified, driving her head closer to the ground, her growls of defiance filling the air. Her claws scraped violently against the floor as she struggled to rise, but Cyan remained unrelenting. He invoked sword manipulation again, and this time, the pressure was unbearable, forcing half of her body into the ground. Kiram's resistance began to waver, her growls turning to strained gasps. Finally, she relented, her voice dripping with bitterness as she muttered her submission. But the insolence in her tone didn't sit well with Cyan. His cold gaze hardened as he prepared to invoke sword manipulation once more, his voice steady and unyielding. Before he could finish the incantation, Kiram broke, her voice trembling with reluctant sincerity. "I accept you as my master," she said, her tone carrying a mix of exhaustion and defeat. Satisfied, Cyan released his grip, stepping back as Kiram pulled herself free from the earth. Dusting his hands off, he surveyed the temple. His mission was complete, and it was time to leave. He had been gone long enough. People would start to notice his absence soon enough. He turned, Kiram's dagger form solid in his grasp. The red mist swirled around his hand, her presence still lingering. Kiram's voice echoed from the blade, a chuckle escaping her. "It's been ages since I've felt fresh air," she mused, her tone unexpectedly light, almost playful. Before Cyan could reply, a strange black mass emerged from the sword, a quirky blob with glowing eyes, a wide mouth, and messy pink hair. The creature bobbed cheerfully in the air, its voice giddy with delight. "Ah, refreshing," it exclaimed, spinning in circles as though it had just woken from a long slumber. The wisp danced around Cyan, Kiram's curious gaze fixed on him. She hovered near his shoulder before asking with innocent wonder, "What's your name?" Cyan, unbothered, didn't glance back. He continued walking, his voice steady and calm. "Cyan Vert." Kiram tilted her head, clearly perplexed. She had never heard of the name Cyan Vert before, and a flicker of doubt crossed her features. With a raised brow, she asked, "Was Air really foolish enough to choose someone like you as the next successor? You're just a kid." Cyan didn't break his stride, his gaze fixed ahead. With quiet confidence, he confirmed, "Air did indeed choose me to be the successor, though that was before my regression, in my previous life." The mention of a previous life made Kiram pause. Her confusion deepened. Previous life? She couldn't wrap her mind around what he meant by that. Cyan, sensing the conversation could spiral into more confusion, simply shrugged and added, "I died once before." Kiram floated silently, her confusion deepening as she tried to grasp the strange things Cyan was saying. Who was he really? After a moment, her gaze drifted to the floating divine sword. She muttered under her breath that it was still asleep. Cyan had stopped in front of the sword, his eyes fixed on its hilt. He knew the sword's master wouldn't show up for another 20 years, and that thought stirred something dark within him. Kiram ground her teeth, her curiosity piqued. She asked, "Do you know something about the sword that I don't?" Cyan didn't answer her, his focus now entirely on the dagger in his hand. With a swift motion, he swung it at the hilt of the divine sword, catching the hilt with his other hand. The sword fell with a deafening crash, its metal echoing through the chamber, leaving Kiram stunned. "What are you going to do?" she asked, voice tinged with disbelief. A maniacal grin spread across Cyan's face as he looked down at the broken piece of the holy sword in his hand. He knew that holding on to even a fragment of the divine sword would make things far more interesting for him down the line. The rhythmic clatter of the carriage wheels echoed through the silent countryside, each turn slicing through the stillness like a pulse in the veins of the earth. The road curved away from the towering spires of the Duke's castle, stretching toward distant lands scarred by the murmur of impending war. Yet, the scene before him seemed calm, the kind of calm that only heightened the quiet anticipation in the air, an unspoken tension that clung like the subtle scent of rain just before a storm. The carriage rolled to a stop with a groaning creak, the wheels sinking softly into the earth. A whispering breeze stirred the dust, and from behind the wooden door stepped a figure, his polished armor glinting faintly in the pale dawn light. Cyan Vert emerged, his movements deliberate and composed like the noble he should be, his rapier at his side. A weapon, not a mere ornament, ready for the challenges ahead. This was the day. Time had slipped by too swiftly, pulling him toward this moment. He strode forward, his gaze settling on the figures gathered in the barren landscape before him. At the forefront, his father stood, Duke Williers Vert, a man forged from the unyielding bedrock of duty and tradition to protect the front lines. Cyan's greeting was as formal as expected from the son of nobility, his posture straight, rigid, every inch as unyielding as the armor he wore. The Duke's gaze was unwavering, his presence immense, a silent force that seemed to impose itself upon the very air around him, as though the weight of his title bore down on all who stood nearby. The Duke's question to Cyan hung in the air like a heavy silence, the weight of a final offer, a final warning. One last chance to retreat, to avoid the call of destiny. Yet Cyan's resolve was unwavering, his gaze, firm and unyielding, locked with his father's. His heart was already bound to the front lines. There was no turning back. With a slight nod, the Duke motioned to his high knight, a commanding figure in glistening steel. Sir Jurkin advanced without a flicker of doubt, his broad frame moving with the assuredness of a man who had seen the horrors of battle. In his hands, he held a scroll, its parchment glowing faintly, an unmistakable sign of its arcane nature. Cyan's eyes narrowed, recognizing the magic woven into its fibers. It was a summoning, and he braced himself for what was to come. With precise movements, Sir Jurkin unfurled the scroll, releasing it into the air. The symbols scrawled upon its surface ignited in a burst of light, crackling like a fire consuming dry tinder. A swirling, radiant magic circle materialized above the ground, humming with raw, untamed power. Then, with a deafening crackling sound that shook the very earth beneath their feet, a beast emerged from the magical rift. The ground trembled as its paws struck the soil, its body aflame with an unnatural fire that crackled along its spine. The air thickened with the acrid stench of sulfur as it snarled, molten eyes fixating on Cyan. The beast, a hellhound from the infernal valleys of Lemea, exuded an aura of lethal fury. Though classified as a low-level demon, its sheer aggression and fiery might made it a formidable adversary. The creature's mane blazed in the wind, its body radiating searing heat, and it was all too clear. This was no ordinary summon. Cyan's rapier gleamed in the morning light, its sleek blade cutting through the still air as he drew it with effortless precision. His gaze hardened, his body instinctively shifting into a battle-ready stance. There was no second guessing. He understood the weight of the moment. His father had not summoned this creature for show. This was a test. Every detail, from the ancient sigils etched onto the scroll to the fiery hellhound that now loomed before him, spoke of meticulous planning. His father and the knights had carefully set the stage, ensuring this trial would not be won easily. Only the unyielding forces of fire, steel, and sheer will would carry him forward. As the hellhound advanced, flames dancing from its back, Cyan drew in a deep, steadying breath. The heat from the beast's fiery presence pressed in on him, but he remained poised. The battle was not waiting, it was already upon him. Around him, the ducal knights tightened their grips on their swords, their muscles tensing in silent readiness. The air was thick with anticipation. Cyan understood the silent warning. Should this trial falter, the knights would not hesitate to intervene. His father stood behind them, arms crossed and eyes fixed on the scene, his presence commanding and unwavering. The message was clear. In his world, a warrior's words carried weight, but only through action could they prove their worth. To stand among the front lines, Cyan would have to conquer this trial. No exceptions, no shortcuts. Jurkin stood silently, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. His gaze was distant, a hard edge to his thoughts, as memories of Cyan preparing for the trial resurfaced. His fingers brushed over the worn appearance of his sword's scabbard, the scars on its surface a testament to a recent violent battle. Only 3 days ago, Cyan had come to him with an unexpected request, one that lingered in Jurkin's mind like an unshakable shadow. At that moment, Jurkin had been caught off guard, unable to fully comprehend the urgency behind Cyan's words. The young man had explained that time was running out. The Duke's trial was fast approaching, and there could be no more waiting. Cyan was not one to idle away the hours, striking at empty air with his sword. He wanted something more, something real, something practical, a sparring session. Jurkin had hesitated, his unease growing as the request sank in. He had tried to suggest Kranz, his half-brother, as a more suitable opponent. Someone closer to Cyan's age, someone who might engage him more freely. But Cyan had dismissed the suggestion, his eyes filled with a quiet disappointment as he noted how Kranz always seemed to avoid him, disappearing the moment their paths crossed. It had become clear to Jurkin in that instant, there would be no easy way out of this situation. With the trial looming on the horizon and Cyan's unwavering resolve, Jurkin was left with no option but to face the request head-on. In the end, Jurkin gave his agreement, and Cyan's face softened with a rare expression of satisfaction. However, Jurkin was resolute in his conditions. He would engage only with his scabbard, using the sheathed sword to move through the air with practiced grace. His focus, he declared, would be solely on defense, daring Cyan to strike with everything he had. Cyan gave a silent nod, his hand steady as he drew his rapier, prepared for the challenge. But just as the duel was about to begin, something unsettling occurred. Cyan's eyes flickered an eerie red, and his voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. He gave a singular unnerving instruction. Jurkin was to keep silent about the events that would unfold here, especially from his father, the Duke. There was no room for negotiation in his tone. This was an order, not a request. Jurkin stood still, his silence betraying the confusion and unease that began to settle within him. In an instant, Cyan surged forward with unmatched speed. The sharp ring of steel meeting steel echoed through the air as his rapier slammed into Jurkin's scabbard, sending a shockwave of force rippling through Jurkin's arm. The sudden impact left his muscles protesting in agony, as though the very force of the strike was too much to bear. How could such power come from a child barely 10 years old? But Cyan showed no mercy. Before Jurkin could even regain his balance, Cyan was already gone, a blur of motion darting to the side with unnatural grace. Jurkin's gaze snapped to the right, but Cyan had vanished as swiftly as he had appeared. A shift in the air above him made his instincts flare. Without warning, Cyan was descending from above, already poised to strike again. Jurkin's pulse quickened, confusion flooding his mind. When had the boy even moved? There was no time to think. Jurkin's body moved on instinct, pivoting just in time to intercept the next devastating blow. The sharp hiss of the rapier slicing through the air was followed by a resounding clash as it met his scabbard. Cyan's assault was unrelenting, each strike faster than the last, like a storm crashing against Jurken's defenses. He fought to hold his ground, his teeth gritted in determination, but Cyan's fury showed no signs of abating. The rhythm of their battle shifted suddenly. Cyan, sensing an opportunity, launched himself into another strike, aiming high with precise intent. Jurken, ever alert, anticipated the move and raised his scabbard just in time to intercept the blow. The clash between their weapons reverberated through the air, the force of it sending a shockwave that seemed to rattle the very earth beneath their feet. Cyan landed heavily, his chest rising and falling with the strain of the intense session. Though the skirmish had ended, he couldn't deny the gap that still remained between him and Jurken's skill. With a weary but respectful nod, he acknowledged his opponent's superior technique. He offered a quiet gesture of thanks, his voice carrying the weight of both admiration and exhaustion. Jurken, gasping for breath, stood in awe of his young lord's progress. Over the years, he had witnessed Cyan's growth. But this was different. Gone were the days when the boy had been a fragile, untrained youth, fumbling with a blade. Now, standing before him, Cyan's swordplay was a display of precision and skill that left Jurken in quiet admiration. Cyan, equally winded, responded with nothing more than a soft, almost innocent smile. As Jurken reflected on the spar, a surge of pride swelled within him. The battle had been a clear reflection of Cyan's transformation. No longer the naive and frail nobleman he once was, Cyan now stood as a seasoned fighter, resolute and self-assured. At that moment, Jurken had no doubt. Cyan was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, his confidence unwavering. Meanwhile, the hellhound, consumed by fury, continued to snarl menacingly, its molten breath crackling with anger. But Cyan stood unmoved. Without hesitation, he fell into a defensive stance, his mind sharp and focused, anticipating the beast's every move. The hellhound, seething with rage, lunged forward, teeth bared for a devastating strike. Yet Cyan was quicker. In one fluid motion, his rapier met the creature's attack, the clash of steel echoing in the air. The hellhound, its hunger unrelenting, snapped its jaws wide, aiming to tear into Cyan's flesh. But Cyan was prepared. With cold precision, he slashed across the hellhound's right eye, a flawless strike that left the beast reeling. The creature staggered back, blinded and disoriented, its snarls growing frantic. Unable to regain its focus, the hellhound barreled forward in one last reckless charge. But it collided with a nearby boulder, its momentum propelling it into the ground, a heap of fur, fire, and fury. Cyan stood unmoving, his posture unwavering and triumphant. Though he knew he lacked the strength to directly confront the demon beasts, the urgency to complete the trial swiftly drove him forward. The hellhound, undeterred, rose again, its snarls echoing through the air. Determined, Cyan readied himself for the final blow. With a fluid, practiced motion, he swung his rapier, severing the beast's neck in a single stroke. But that wasn't enough. In one seamless leap, Cyan propelled himself into the air, his rapier leaving his hand with the precision of a master. It flew through the air like a deadly missile, its tip driving deep into the hellhound's skull. The impact was earth-shattering, the beast crashing to the ground with a thunderous crash. The watching knights stood in stunned silence, awestruck by the raw power and grace in Cyan's movements. A cold shiver rippled down their spines, the weight of his skill hanging heavy in the air. In the stillness that followed, Cyan's father, the Duke, could not contain the proud smile that curled at the corners of his mouth. Cyan stood over the fallen hellhound, a sense of quiet disappointment washing over him. The demon's blood pooled around its lifeless form, a rich, dark fluid brimming with power. It was a bounty that could easily fill several bottles, a tempting prize. But the temptation faded quickly. Cyan knew the danger, revealing his true nature would draw far more attention than he was willing to invite. For now, he suppressed the urge, though a fleeting thought crossed his mind. Next time, he would bring a cup. With steady hands, he withdrew his rapier from the creature's skull, the blade scraping against the bone with a soft, metallic sound. Then, the silence was broken by slow, deliberate applause. Cyan's gaze shifted, and there stood the Duke. His imposing figure seemed almost regal, a stark contrast to the chaos around him. The Duke's voice rang out, praising Cyan's precision and valor. A wave of pride stirred within him, but Cyan's expression remained unwavering. He nodded in acknowledgement, accepting the praise with a quiet humility that matched his calm demeanor. There was no room for arrogance in this world, not yet. With a dramatic flourish of his cape, the Duke announced that Cyan had earned the right to be sent to the front lines. Without a further glance, he turned on his heel and began walking away, his presence commanding yet distant. Cyan, ever composed, offered a slight bow, his voice steady as he expressed his gratitude for both the praise and the opportunity. As the Duke's footsteps faded, a dark shadow stirred behind Cyan. Kiram, her frustration barely contained, seethed with annoyance. Her emotions flared, and she demanded to know if Cyan truly considered her no more than a mere kitchen knife, a tool to be used and discarded. Her anger was evident, a storm brewing on her face. Cyan remained calm, his response measured and reassuring. He reminded her that she was no ordinary blade but a powerful magic sword, far from something trivial. Yet Kiram's fury didn't subside. With a sharp edge to her words, she pressed him further, questioning why he hadn't wielded her during the trial. The magic sword's power waned without blood, and her need for sustenance was unbearable. The nearby pool of blood seemed like an oasis, but she could not reach it on her own, the trembling hunger in her voice betraying the depth of her craving. Cyan maintained his composure, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the growing tension. He reassured her that there was no cause for concern, his voice steady and unwavering. His words caught Kiram's attention, causing a momentary hesitation. But that pause was brief, for Kiram's expression swiftly shifted into something darker, a palpable menace curling around Cyan. Without a second thought, he called upon her, and the atmosphere thickened, a dense purple-red mist swirling from his very being. Yet, despite the tension mounting around them, Cyan stood resolute. He remained unfazed, and told the magic sword that she would eat a lot soon. His only command was for her to wait for now. Kiram, her frustration still simmering, let out a sigh, his words laced with irritation. She muttered under his breath that at the very least, Cyan could have awakened her first. A massive, axe-wielding ogre charged across the battlefield, its roars filled with fury as it stampeded toward the front lines. Each earth-shaking step sent tremors through the ground, but the soldiers swiftly adjusted, repositioning toward the northwest to intercept the towering threat. The sound of bells rang out ominously through the air, their tolls signaling the imminent clash. Amidst the chaos, the Duke, commander of the forces, shouted out a sharp, unwavering command. His voice cut through the noise like a blade, rallying his men into formation with the order to show no mercy to the demonic horde. With the Duke's directive clear, not a single monster was to survive, and the ducal knights responded in unison, their swords raised high with unyielding resolve. In the blink of an eye, they invoked their most powerful formation, Restraints of Salvation. A brilliant flash of light erupted from their ranks, and the heavens above seemed to crack open with the force of a holy cross, its radiance blinding and fierce. The brilliance surged across the battlefield, overwhelming the monstrous army and searing their eyes, leaving them stunned and helpless. From beneath their feet, glowing magical circles appeared, throwing the demonic beasts in a state of confusion. With a swift pulse, chains of pure, radiant magic shot out, binding the monsters tightly and rendering them immobile. As the enemy was ensnared, the Duke's forces surged forward, their charge as thunderous and unrelenting as the storm itself. The knights, their bodies forged through years of unrelenting discipline, rode with flawless precision, a seamless force in battle. Their swords sliced through the air, cleaving through ogres with chilling efficiency, each strike as natural as breathing. The largest of the beasts, thrashing against its magical bonds, tried in vain to break free, but before it could react, a knight charged forward. With a single, decisive swing, his blade sheared through the ogre's thick neck, sending its head spiraling through the air to land with a grotesque thud at Cyan's feet. Amid the chaos, Cyan remained unmoved, his expression cold and detached, as the severed head rolled across the ground. He glanced briefly at it, his face betraying no hint of emotion. Behind him, Emily, his loyal maid, stood frozen in horror, her pale face streaked with tears. Trembling, she pleaded with him, her voice filled with desperation, questioning why he had chosen to venture into such peril. Yet Cyan, seemingly untouched by the bloodshed surrounding them, offered no reply. His gaze drifted elsewhere, indifferent to her frantic pleas, as if the world of violence and death had no hold on him. Cyan sat motionless on his horse, his eyes wandering across the desolate landscape that stretched before him. The sight was both unsettling and strangely familiar, an expanse marred by monsters and chaos, a place where danger lurked in every corner. Despite the threat, a wave of nostalgia swept through him, as if he had missed this brutal world, with all its perils, in some twisted way. The stillness was shattered by the sound of Emily's cries, a stark contrast to the violent scene unfolding around them. But as the Duke, Cyan's father, approached with unshakable composure, her sobs gradually quieted. The Duke's presence was commanding, and he directed his gaze to Cyan, inquiring about his feelings after his return from the front lines. Cyan, ever obedient, hesitated for a moment before admitting, with a tinge of uncertainty, that he felt uneasy. The Duke nodded gravely, his voice steady and unwavering as he reminded his son of the unforgiving reality of war. A soldier's fate could turn in an instant, regardless of skill or preparation. He urged Cyan to remain vigilant, a piece of wisdom the young man accepted with quiet resolve, the weight of it settling deep within him. The front lines were a harsh, unyielding expanse, a place where time seemed to bleed together, and each day was a relentless continuation of the last. Cyan understood the grim rhythm of this existence, where every moment unfolded with the weight of battle, and the war was governed by precision and protocol. The High Knights stood as pillars, central to the fight against the demon beasts that surged ever forward, an unceasing tide of chaos. In the distance, explosions echoed like the ominous thrum of a war drum, setting the pulse for yet another day of conflict. Inside the tent, Cyan watched the knights standing guard, their attention fixed and alert. His tent, positioned the farthest from the front lines, was meant to offer some safety amidst the chaos around them. Yet, even in this moment of relative peace, a troubling thought filled his mind: how to find food for Kiram. The simple question seemed to have no easy answer, and it lingered, unanswered. Waiting for nightfall felt like his best option. His eyes shifted to Emily, curled up in a tangle of bedsheets. She was visibly trembling, a picture of fear. Cyan's frustration grew. What was she doing now? She poked her head out from the blankets like a snail hiding in its shell, and reminded him of the Duke's unsettling words, that death could come at any moment, even in the middle of a battle. Cyan sighed, exasperated, and urged her to stop complaining and pack up to head home. Emily shot him a furious glare, stunned by his dismissive attitude. She reminded him that he would be completely lost without her, unable to manage anything on his own. Cyan closed his eyes, trying to ignore her shouting. The looming danger of demonic beasts at the front should have been his focus, but instead, Emily's voice kept ringing in his ears. Despite her fear, she wouldn't leave. She knew that if she did, no one would be there to take care of Cyan. But still, Cyan couldn't bring himself to say anything back, even though he was her master. With a sharp tone, Emily ordered him to move aside so she could prepare his meal. She grabbed his cape to leave, and before Cyan could object, she was already walking out, leaving him alone in the quiet of the tent. He stood in silence, his teeth grinding in frustration. For a moment, he considered sending her away, but the thought only made him angrier. How dare she treat him this way? She showed no respect for him, her master, and the feeling ate at him more than he was willing to admit. That night, Cyan placed a doll in his bed, one crafted to resemble him, a simple yet clever ruse. The plan was flawless, or so it seemed. But his brief respite was shattered when Emily stirred, murmuring in her half-conscious state, asking if he was heading out for his usual late-night exercise. A chill ran down his spine as panic set in. He quickly countered with a question of his own, asking if she was fully awake. In her groggy state, Emily mumbled praise for his discipline, commenting that the Duke would surely appreciate his unwavering commitment. A wave of relief washed over Cyan as he donned his cloak. With a soft, reassuring voice, he instructed Emily to look after him, assuring her that he would be resting peacefully in bed. Still caught in the haze of sleep, Emily accepted his words without a second thought, and the silence of the night returned. Yet, as Cyan prepared to slip away, his thoughts briefly wandered back to the tight security he had faced on the front lines. Tonight, though, was different. Cloaked in his mist aura, he moved like a shadow, evading the watchful eyes of the guards. He passed unnoticed, slipping into the darkened valley beyond, the rare taste of freedom he had longed for. This was his chance, and he could not afford to waste it. Cyan then used the third stance of the black mist, foggy descent. In a fluid, silent motion, he descended from the towering cliff, the wind whispering past him as he touched the ground with the precision of a predator. No sound, no trace left behind. He paused for a moment, feeling the air of the place settle around him. This was no ordinary spot. It was a high-risk zone, teeming with creatures like hellhounds that lurked in the darkness. For a magic sword like Kiram, it was the perfect hunting ground, a banquet of blood waiting to be devoured. Cyan's eyes gleamed with a deep red intensity as he turned inward, almost as if communicating with the presence within him. He asked if Kiram was in agreement. The response was immediate. From within, Kiram surged forward, a magic sword materializing in his hand, her voice low but evident with excitement. The scent of blood was thick in the air, and she could already feel the thrill of the hunt. She could barely control herself. Cyan's body tensed as he assumed a battle stance, every muscle primed for the fight ahead. Kiram's voice echoed with impatience. "Hurry, let me cut something already." With that, the hunt was on. The horde of hellhounds lunged toward Cyan, their eyes gleaming with hunger, treating him like a midnight snack. Unfazed, Cyan enveloped himself in the swirling purple mist, a shield against their savage advance. He swished Kiram to the side, signaling her to cut as she saw fit. With a swift motion, he swung his magic blade, a violent arc of power that cleaved through the air. His teeth clenched, and with one precise slash, he cut a hellhound in half, its body falling apart with ease. Cyan's gaze darkened red, focused on the rest of the monsters surrounding him. With a chilling determination, he unleashed his misty blade. Foggy tempest. He moved like a tempest itself, a blur of flashing steel. Every turn, every movement, was a deadly strike, leaving a trail of dismembered creatures in his wake. The hellhounds were no match for his relentless fury, their bodies crumpling and dissolving under the sharpness of his magic blade. As the chaos settled down, Cyan approached one of the largest hellhounds, piercing a tube embedded in its neck. Demonic blood began to trickle down the tube, dark and viscous, into a wooden cup held in his hand. With casual ease, Cyan took a sip from the cup, as though drinking a fine beer. His mist aura grew denser, more powerful, rippling with renewed strength. Wiping his mouth with satisfaction, Cyan commented that the drink really hit the spot. Kiram, feeling the same sensation as her master, remarked how refreshing it was, especially after having been sealed for so long. More hellhounds emerged from the shadows, encircling Cyan. Undeterred, Cyan saw this as the perfect moment to continue his training. He was eager to push his limits. Kiram, however, disagreed, commenting that if he kept battling such weak creatures, it would take him forever to grow stronger. Cyan, with a grin, reassured her that the night was far from over. His gaze swept across the growing horde, his excitement palpable. The hellhounds were only the beginning. As if on cue, new threats appeared. Ogres lumbering with immense strength, trolls with gnarled limbs, harpies soaring with savage grace, massive crocodiles slithering through the ground, and even a twisted gorilla-like creature, eyes wild with madness. The variety of monsters was overwhelming, yet to Kiram, a surge of exhilaration coursed through her. There was no end to the fine food in front of her. On the rugged cliffside path leading toward the front lines, 2 carriages rumbled steadily, their progress carefully guarded by a line of knights. One of the carriages, its windows offering a limited view, contained a young girl who peered out, her gaze fixed on the vast, distant landscape. A vigilant knight rode by her side, ensuring her safety in the perilous terrain. A servant, noticing the tense atmosphere, could not help but voice her concern. She quietly mentioned how dangerous the front lines were, her words laced with worry. With genuine respect, she turned to the young girl, suggesting that perhaps it was still not too late to turn back from the threat ahead. The girl, a noble by all appearances, responded firmly, her expression unwavering. She directed a steady gaze at her servant and calmly instructed her not to treat her as a child. With quiet authority, she emphasized that she would not repeat herself. As the imperial princess, it was her duty to accompany her father, the emperor, on this critical journey to the front lines. There would be no room for further discussion about turning back. The servant, though still anxious, could do little but offer a sincere apology. She lowered her head, acknowledging the princess's wishes, despite the lingering worry in her heart. The servant suddenly recalled something and shared a startling piece of information. The Duke's youngest son was also stationed at the front lines. She went on to mention that the youngest son was the same age as the princess, a revelation that made the princess break out in a cold sweat. The thought that the Duke had sent his youngest son into the most perilous of situations shocked her. The servant quickly clarified, though, stating that it had been the young man's own decision to volunteer for the front lines, something he had chosen without any pressure from his father. She even suggested that perhaps the two might become friends. The princess, however, simply pouted and dismissed the idea, expressing that she was not interested and would be going to sleep. The servant, realizing her suggestion had not been well received, flinched and hurriedly apologized, her nerves apparent. The room fell into a heavy silence for a moment, but the princess's curiosity soon got the better of her. Without looking at the servant, she asked for the name of the Duke's youngest son. The servant, eager to answer, quickly replied that his name was Cyan Vert. The princess paused, her expression distant as she repeated the name to herself. She murmured Cyan one more time before turning toward the window. Her gaze softened, and the moonlight spilled over her, casting an ethereal glow that accentuated her striking features. Her pale skin shimmered beneath the silvery light, her red eyes gleaming with a mix of intrigue and something far deeper, while her long silver hair flowed like a cascade of moonlight itself. A harpy let out a shrill cry as steel tore through her flesh, her body convulsing before she coughed up blood. Within moments, life drained from her eyes, and she plummeted lifelessly to the battlefield below. Her feathers scattered like ash in the darkened sky, marking the battle's end. The air was thick with the scent of iron, the sky above painted in a deep crimson hue. Amidst the fallen bodies of monsters, the Duke stood tall, his blade still slick with blood. His voice rang out, commanding his soldiers to check for casualties. Nearby, a massive hippogriff lay sprawled on the ground, its twisted form a testament to the fierce battle. Soldiers gathered around, their breaths heavy with exhaustion. One of them, having overheard the Duke's command, stepped forward and reported that none had been lost. The Duke exhaled, his grip on his sword relaxing slightly. He strode toward his men, nodding in silent relief that his forces remained unscathed. With a curt order, he instructed them to return to camp. But then, mid-stride, he abruptly halted. His sharp gaze flickered toward something in the distance, his expression shifting, mild surprise etched across his face. Something had caught his attention. Nearby, a soldier stood with his boots firmly planted on the lifeless harpy, his grip steady as he wrenched his sword free from its bloodied corpse. It was Cyan. With a measured motion, he flicked the remnants of battle from his blade and sheathed it, his gaze cold and indifferent as he regarded the fallen creature. Not a shred of emotion flickered across his face. Flanking him were two soldiers, their stances alert as they scanned the area for any lingering threats. The battlefield had fallen into a heavy silence, the only sounds being the distant murmurs of soldiers tending to the wounded. Then, a voice cut through the quiet, a deep, commanding tone. "Have you adjusted to life on the front lines?" At the familiar voice, Cyan turned. Without meeting his father's gaze, he dipped his head slightly, pressing a hand over his chest in a gesture of acknowledgement. His response was calm, unwavering. He stated that he had adjusted and that each passing day offered invaluable lessons. The Duke's brows lifted ever so slightly, surprise flickering in his otherwise unreadable expression. He had expected his son to falter, perhaps even ask to return home after a day or two. Instead, Cyan stood firm. The Duke narrowed his eyes slightly, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Cyan's head lifted in surprise. That word, pride, felt foreign coming from his father. In his past life, the Duke had never once expressed it toward him. Without another word, the Duke turned away, striding toward the camp. His voice carried over his shoulder, steady and firm. He had something important to discuss with Cyan the following morning. As soon as he awoke, he was to report to the barracks. Cyan remained still, watching his father walk away with Jerkin at his side. For a fleeting moment, he found himself speechless. He had never seen that expression on his father's face before, certainly not in his previous life. Realizing his father was nearly out of earshot, he straightened his posture and responded in a measured tone. "Yes, father." Beneath the crimson-streaked night sky, stars flickered like distant embers. Far from the safety of the camp, a deafening crash shattered the silence as massive boulders crumbled under the force of impact. A colossal deathworm had emerged, its immense body slamming into the rocky terrain, sending debris scattering in every direction. Cyan skidded backward, his stance shifting into a defensive posture, dagger poised in his grip. The tremor from the creature's landing sent a ripple of irritation through him. Towering over 10 feet tall, the deathworm loomed like an unholy behemoth, its grotesque form riddled with patches of toxic decay. He exhaled sharply. Facing mid-tier monsters was routine, but encountering a deathworm this close to camp was an unexpected complication. These creatures were supposed to lurk deeper in the valley, not here. Something was wrong. As the chaos unfolded, Kiram's voice echoed in Cyan's mind, laced with amusement. She casually remarked that he seemed to be struggling and coyly suggested that she take over for a while. Cyan shot her a sideways glance, his expression unreadable. "Take over," he mused aloud. She wasn't even trying to conceal her true intentions anymore. Kiram, undeterred, reassured him that he had nothing to worry about. She promised to relinquish control as soon as the fight was over. Her tone shifted, sharp with urgency. The deathworm's toxic wounds were beginning to heal. He could keep hacking away, but it would be nothing more than a waste of time and energy. Annoyed but acknowledging the truth in her words, Cyan exhaled sharply. A month of grueling training, countless demon beasts slain, and still, it wasn't enough. The deathworm let out a deafening screech before lunging at him with startling speed, far too agile for its massive size. His grip on the dagger tightened. He had no choice. Kiram was right. If he wanted to end this, he would have to let her take over. With unwavering resolve, Cyan wielded Kiram with lethal precision, shifting into an offensive stance. A deep purple radiance engulfed the dagger as tendrils of dark mist coiled around him, their presence thick and suffocating. Kiram, barely able to contain her exhilaration, reveled in the opportunity to unleash her full power. Ninth stance of the Black Mist, manifestation of the magical sword. In the blink of an eye, the deathworm lunged, its massive form hurtling towards Cyan with terrifying speed. Yet, in that same instant, he vanished. A hush fell over the battlefield. Then came the sound of flesh being torn asunder. Deep crimson gashes materialized across the deathworm's grotesque form, 100 lacerations carving through its thick, armored hide with merciless efficiency. The behemoth screeched, a chilling, guttural wail as torrents of blood poured from its ravaged body. Against the sheer force of Kiram's power, even a high-tier monster was nothing more than prey. Cyan hovered midair, his silhouette illuminated by the crimson-stained moon. His face was now shrouded in pure black, his eyes glowing like twin embers in the abyss. His hair, once restrained, billowed wildly, resembling an infernal blaze. Misty blade. 8. Fluttering petals. Kiram's voice resonated through him as she took full control, guiding his movements with unrelenting grace. With a single decisive stroke, he brought the blade down. The deathworm split apart in an instant. As the two halves collapsed with an earth-shaking thud, Kiram landed, her feet touching the blood-soaked ground. The battle had ended, swift and merciless. Elsewhere on the battlefield, a soldier crouched beside the slain monster, examining the fresh bloodstains. He noted that it had not been long since the creature was killed. Behind him, Jurkin stood holding a torch, his gaze shifting toward the approaching figure of the Duke. He observed the nature of the wounds, concluding that whoever was responsible possessed formidable magic. The possibility that this could be the work of a high-level demon crossed his mind. The Duke knelt beside the carcass, running a gloved hand over the deep, precise lacerations. His expression remained unreadable as he assessed the damage. If demons had ventured this close to the camp, he reasoned, it could not be ignored. They could not allow any threats to breach their defenses. His eyes remained fixed on the mangled remains as he issued his command to Jurkin. The soldiers were to search the perimeter thoroughly, leaving no ground unchecked. The monster corpses were to be burned immediately, ensuring no traces remained. The Duke's gaze lingered on the wounds. A dark crimson mist seeped from the gashes, curling ominously into the night air. Something about these cuts felt eerily familiar. His brow furrowed as a sense of unease settled over him. His grip tightened. The precision of these strikes, the energy emanating from the wounds, he had seen this before. Whether it was déjà vu or something far more unsettling, he could not yet determine. Jurkin, standing a few feet away from the Duke, called out to him, his tone firm yet urgent. He insisted that the Duke had to see something. The Duke turned slightly, his expression unreadable, before rising to his feet and striding toward Jurkin. Lifting his torch higher, Jurkin illuminated the battlefield before them. The flickering light cast long, wavering shadows, revealing a sight that left the Duke momentarily stunned. Before them lay the massive corpse of the deathworm, cleaved cleanly in half. Its immense form sprawled across the blood-soaked ground, its thick, armored hide brutally severed with surgical precision. The sheer devastation of the scene rendered the Duke momentarily speechless. He had seen many monstrous beasts slain in battle, but this was something else entirely. The level of destruction, the sheer force required to butcher a death worm so thoroughly, defied belief. The Duke's expression darkened, a deep scowl etching across his face as a bead of sweat trailed down his cheek. A familiar unease settled over him. Could it be them, the ones who wielded that cursed technique? The manifestation of the magical sword, a state in which Kiram fully took control of Cyan's body, allowing her to unleash her power without restraint. But Cyan knew the danger. If he wasn't careful, he could lose himself entirely, his consciousness swallowed whole by the entity within the blade. A hollow, eerie smile crept onto Cyan's lips, perfectly mirroring Kiram's twisted expression. His eyes gleamed an ominous red, their glow intensifying as Kiram's influence deepened, threatening to consume him entirely. The next morning, Cyan awoke in his bed, sweat clinging to his skin as dark shadows hung beneath his weary eyes. The lingering exhaustion weighed heavily on him. He had actually used that technique just to kill a single monster. Sitting up, he ran a hand over his forehead, wincing as a dull ache pulsed through his body. The aftermath of last night's transformation left every muscle sore, a harsh reminder of the toll it exacted. Still, he supposed it could have been worse. Had he not been consuming monster blood for the past month, his body might have been utterly ruined. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by Kiram's voice. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of her wisp-like form hovering nearby, her presence as persistent as ever. With a sly grin, she floated around him, her tone laced with amusement. Though Cyan appeared to be nothing more than a 10-year-old boy on the outside, there was nothing childlike about the way he spoke or carried himself. Cyan met her gaze with an indifferent stare, his fingers idly brushing against his forehead, unfazed by her observation. Kiram reminisced about the first time she had encountered Cyan in the underground temple. From the way he had handled her, it was clear he had never wielded her before. Yet despite that inexperience, he had moved with an eerie familiarity, as if he had done it countless times. He also knew Lamia Valley with unsettling precision, navigating its treacherous terrain as though he had memorized every inch of it. And then there was last night, the way he executed the techniques of the mist, as if he had honed them relentlessly for decades. A slow, sinister smile spread across Kiram's face, her sharp teeth glinting in the dim morning light. She recalled something else, how Cyan had once told her that he had died before. The pieces clicked into place. He hadn't simply trained for years, he had returned to the past. Cyan met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unreadable. Then, with casual indifference, he reminded her that he had already mentioned his regression the first time they met in the temple. Kiram's eyes widened slightly, her mouth parting as if to respond, but for a moment, no words came. Then, realization gave way to irritation. Snarling at her own stupidity, she snapped at Cyan, accusing him of doing a terrible job explaining it to her. Unbothered, Cyan turned away, his gaze distant, as he simply stated that it was a long story. Kiram clenched her teeth, deep in thought. Someone like Cyan, in his past life, wouldn't have been easy to kill, which meant only one possibility. His death had to be at the hands of the owner of Duran Dark. And there were only two ways that could have happened. Either he had lost in a fair duel, or he had been betrayed. As she continued piecing together her theory, Cyan's mind drifted back to the final moments of his past life. The cold sting of betrayal, the searing pain of his brother's blade piercing through him. Kiram finally voiced her conclusion. Betrayal. That was the most likely answer. Her lips curled into a sly grin. Cyan turned to her, mildly surprised at how accurately she had deduced the truth. He studied her for a moment before asking what led her to that conclusion. With a knowing chuckle, Kiram reminded him of the unmistakable glare he had given the holy sword. She would have to be utterly dense not to notice something so obvious. Kiram hovered closer, locking eyes with Cyan, her gaze sharp and unyielding. She knew exactly what he was after: revenge. Cyan's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing at her perceptiveness. But Kiram wasn't finished. Whether he had returned to the past or sought vengeance, she wanted him to remember one thing. Pressing forward, she butted heads with him, her stare unwavering. With a wicked smirk, she dared him to show even the slightest sign of weakness, because the moment he did, his body would be hers. Irritated by her antics, Cyan swatted her away like an annoying insect, reminding her, with a sharp reprimand, to know her place. He was her master, and he wasn't a fool. Kiram yelped as she went flying across the room, crashing into a pile of books before tumbling to the ground in a daze. Her tiny frame trembled as she struggled to shake off the impact, her eyes spinning. Cyan smirked, a wave of déjà vu washing over him. Even in this life, she was still the same old Kiram. Nothing about her had changed. Cyan dressed quickly and stepped out of his tent into the desolate expanse of the barren lands. The air was tense, and soldiers rushed past him in hurried strides, their murmurs barely audible, yet filled with urgency. Pausing, Cyan observed the commotion around him. There was an undeniable sense of unrest among the troops, a subtle yet persistent unease that prickled at the edges of his awareness. Something was happening. Moments later, Emily scrambled toward him, her breath labored from exertion. She hastily acknowledged his presence, relief flickering in her eyes at the sight of the young lord awake. Noting her anxious demeanor, Cyan met her gaze with measured calm. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone steady despite the turmoil unfolding around them. Emily clutched her hands tightly to her chest, her eyes wide with panic. Struggling to steady her breath, she relayed the urgent news. The Duke and his soldiers had discovered a high-level monster at the valley's entrance the previous night. Cyan tensed at her words, a flicker of unease crossing his features. His mind immediately went to the deathworm he had slain. Could this be the cause of the soldiers' distress? Had they uncovered something more? Emily, regaining her composure, continued, explaining that it had been a long time since a monster of that caliber had appeared so close to the camp. Before she could finish, Cyan abruptly cut her off. His gaze sharpened as he asked whether the Duke or the others had noticed anything else, anything suspicious. Emily stood frozen, unable to comprehend how Cyan remained so composed amid the chaos. Her lips parted, but no words came. Meanwhile, Cyan's gaze sharpened, urgency flickering in his eyes as he pressed her again. Had the soldiers mentioned anything else? Had they seen a suspicious figure? Had they taken note of anything concerning him? Before she could respond, the heavy clank of metal armor echoed toward them. Emily's eyes darted to the approaching figure, a burly man with a commanding presence. It was Jurkin. Stopping before them, Jurkin inclined his head slightly, closing his eyes as he placed a gauntleted hand over his chest. In a calm yet authoritative tone, he informed Cyan that his grace was looking for him. Cyan turned toward Jurkin, his expression unreadable, but inwardly, he knew this was far from good. His father and the soldiers had arrived at the battlefield unexpectedly last night. He recalled the monsters he had slain, their corpses left unattended in his haste to retreat. A flicker of frustration surged through him as he gritted his teeth. He had intended to remain unnoticed, keeping his abilities hidden until he entered the academy. With measured steps, Cyan entered his father's tent, bowing his head in deference. In a steady voice, he announced his presence. The youngest of House Vert stood before his father. The Duke stood before him, his expression impassive, offering no hint of his thoughts. A prickle of unease crept up Cyan's spine. Was this about the events of last night? Had his father already uncovered the truth? Without preamble, the Duke's cold, commanding voice cut through the silence, instructing Cyan to take a seat. Cyan complied, though his heartbeat pounded in his ears. Worry gnawed at him. What would he say if his father questioned him? Cyan sat across from his father, the silence between them heavy and unyielding. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words, a tension neither chose to acknowledge. Finally, the Duke shattered the quiet with a measured tone, his gaze sharp and probing. He would be direct. What had Cyan been doing last night? A bead of sweat slid down Cyan's temple, yet his expression remained composed, unwavering. With deliberate calm, he met his father's gaze and stated that he had retired early, citing exhaustion. The Duke regarded him in silence, his piercing eyes scrutinizing every nuance of his son's demeanor. He allowed the statement to settle, yet his mind reeled with the details of the previous night. Cyan's claim echoed in his thoughts, but the memory of those deep crimson gashes on the slain monster gnawed at him. Those wounds, precise, lethal, and eerily familiar, bore an unmistakable resemblance to Cyan's swordsmanship. The Duke remained silent, yet suspicion stirred within him. The Duke narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing Cyan intently as he weighed the possibility. Was his suspicion justified, or was he merely grasping at shadows? Cyan, maintaining an air of innocence, tilted his head slightly and inquired why his father was so concerned about his whereabouts the previous night. His tone was calm, almost nonchalant, yet his words were carefully chosen. The Duke, however, remained silent, lost in contemplation. The events of the night before played through his mind. The monstrous deathworm, its massive form cleaved apart with unnerving precision. It was difficult to fathom that a mere boy, even one as capable as Cyan, could have been responsible for such a feat. And yet, the uncanny familiarity of those wounds left him unsettled. The Duke's prolonged silence unsettled Cyan. He called out to his father again, but the man remained deep in thought. Inwardly, Cyan questioned what could have captured his father's attention so thoroughly. Crossing his arms, the Duke finally broke the silence, his gaze sharp as he asked Cyan if he had heard about the incident near the camp. Cyan said nothing, his expression unreadable. The Duke continued, explaining that they were still investigating the matter, but the evidence suggested that a covert group of assassins known as the Mist was responsible for the attack. At the mention of the name, Cyan's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. He quickly masked his reaction, feigning ignorance about the organization. The Duke went on, his voice steady but laced with gravity. The Mist was an ancient order, an elusive sect that had existed for centuries. Their true purpose remained shrouded in secrecy, but they were known for assassinating nobles under the guise of purification. Their calling card was the lingering black mist left at the scene of their kills. For centuries, the mist had vanished without a trace. Their last recorded appearance was over 300 years ago, but the body of the deathworm from last night bore unmistakable traces of that same black mist, a dark aura imbued with the mark of Air, the god of darkness. He was the deity they served, the very source of their formidable power. The Duke's expression remained impassive as he voiced his conclusion. The ones responsible for slaying the deathworm and the other demonic beasts were none other than the Mist. Cyan's breath hitched for a fraction of a second. His father's insight was remarkable. To deduce the culprit based solely on the remnants of their distinctive wounds, left by an organization that had disappeared 3 centuries ago, was nothing short of extraordinary. The Duke continued, his tone carrying the weight of authority. The true reason behind the Mist's disappearance remained unknown, but one thing was certain. If they had indeed returned, it was cause for concern. He advised Cyan to remain vigilant, stating that he would report the incident to the Empire without delay. Cyan gave a respectful nod, carefully schooling his features. Beneath his calm exterior, unease stirred. Had he truly evaded suspicion? Or was his father merely testing him? A quiet sigh escaped the Duke as he leaned back slightly, his thoughts shifting. Logically, it made little sense to associate Cyan, still so young, with an organization as enigmatic and formidable as the Mist. Their existence alone defied reason. If they had truly resurfaced after 300 years, then this was no mere anomaly. It signified something far greater lurking beneath the surface. Shaking off his contemplation, The Duke shifted the conversation. He inquired whether Cyan was aware of today's visitors. Cyan blinked, momentarily thrown off by the abrupt change in topic. After a brief pause, he replied that he had heard mention of His Highness paying them a visit, but had not been informed of the exact schedule. He then asked if the visit was taking place today. The Duke clasped his hands together, resting his elbows on the table as he regarded Cyan with a measured smile. His gaze held a knowing glint as he confirmed Cyan's assumption and smoothly transitioned into a request. Cyan, momentarily taken aback, felt a flicker of curiosity beneath his lingering thoughts of the mist. Straightening slightly, he met his father's gaze and inquired about the favor. Beyond the walls of the tent, the blaring call of a horn resonated through the camp, signaling the arrival of His Majesty. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. The Duke was the first to lower himself onto one knee, his movements precise and unwavering. Behind him, Cyan followed suit, mirroring his father's stance. Yurkin, along with the gathered soldiers, quickly bowed their heads in reverence. Without raising his gaze, the Duke's voice carried with practiced grace and authority. Williers Vert, Duke of Velias, humbly greets His Imperial Majesty. Seated atop his horse, the Emperor regarded the gathering with a warm, almost nostalgic smile. His silver hair gleamed under the morning sun, contrasting sharply with the obsidian black of his beard. Atop his head rested a golden crown, its grandeur accentuated by a single resplendent ruby embedded at its center. Clad in silver-plated armor that defied the frailty of age, he exuded both regality and strength, the flowing crimson cape at his back, a symbol of his imperial authority. With practiced ease, the Emperor dismounted, his boots meeting the earth with a measured step. His gaze settled on the kneeling Duke, and without hesitation, he placed both hands firmly upon Williers Vert's shoulders. His voice, rich with familiarity, carried an amused lilt as he reminded the Duke that they were once old comrades, and such formality between them was unnecessary. For a fleeting moment, the Duke was rendered speechless, his composure wavering under the weight of the Emperor's words. Then, the Emperor's keen red eyes drifted toward the young master at his side. His expression shifted, curiosity threading his tone as he turned to the Duke and inquired, "Is this the one?" Cyan, who had remained silent until now, immediately bowed with impeccable grace. With measured respect, he lifted his head just enough to meet the Emperor's gaze and introduced himself. Cyan Vert, youngest son of the House of Vert, greets His Imperial Majesty. The Emperor's smile deepened as he commended Cyan for enduring such hardships at a young age while serving on the front lines. His praise extended to the Duke, remarking that the children of House Vert had always been extraordinary compared to their peers. Cyan allowed himself a subtle smirk, inwardly amused. He had been bracing himself for a burdensome favor, yet it turned out to be nothing more than playing the role of the Emperor's son. A trivial task. In his past life, he had remained within the confines of the mansion, indifferent to the Empire's affairs, unconcerned by its visits. Yet now, something was different. His father's trust in him stirred an unfamiliar feeling, one that he found himself unwilling to ignore. As the conversation unfolded, a servant approached the grand carriage stationed behind the Emperor, pulling open its ornately crafted door. The Emperor turned toward the Duke, his tone casual yet deliberate, as he mentioned that he had someone to introduce. Then, with a graceful step, a figure emerged from within. Delicate brown shoes met the earth first, followed by the hem of a red and black dress adorned with intricate gold embroidery. As she fully stepped into the light, her striking white hair cascaded over her shoulders, its brilliance a perfect mirror of her father's own. Crimson eyes, rich with nobility and quiet strength, met the gathered company with unwavering poise. Bowing elegantly, she spoke in a refined yet composed tone. "I am Arin Sevelis, 5th Princess of the Wusif Empire. It is an honor to make your acquaintance." Cyan studied the girl before him, his mind stirring with recognition. She was the unfortunate princess. His father had mentioned that he would be escorting her today. Turning back to the Duke, Cyan offered a polite apology, admitting that he wasn't entirely sure what was expected of him. The Duke, unfazed, reassured him that there was nothing to be concerned about. His only task was to keep her company. With a measured tone, the Duke elaborated, explaining that Cyan was likely to cross paths with her again at the academy, since they were of the same age. Was that not the case? Cyan recalled glimpsing her a few times in his past life, fleeting encounters during the occasional switching of classes. The Duke continued, emphasizing that there was no harm in forging connections with the royal family. Though their meeting today would be brief, he wished for nothing more than for Cyan to establish a good rapport with her. Cyan regarded his father in quiet contemplation. Even though he had no particular interest in the matter, he understood the Duke's intentions. His father likely hoped for a friendship between them, one that could mirror the deep bond he shared with the Emperor. But he had chosen the wrong person. Aaron Sevelis was not someone capable of such a thing. Suppressing a sigh, Cyan kept his thoughts to himself. He was the only one who knew what the future held, and for now, that knowledge would remain his burden alone. Although it was an inconvenience, Cyan resolved to follow his father's wishes, for now. Standing beside Irene, he noticed her hesitate before speaking. After a brief pause, she finally asked why the river had such an unusual red hue. Cyan tilted his head slightly. Was she referring to the Blood River? When she responded with confusion, he realized she was unfamiliar with the name. As they approached the river's edge, standing at the precipice of the cliff, Aaron peered down into the crimson waters, her expression laced with suspicion. The unnatural color unsettled her. Cyan explained in a composed tone that the river coursed through the entirety of Lamia Valley. As for its color, there was no mystical or supernatural reason behind it, merely the brutal laws of nature at play. He elaborated further, revealing that old or wounded demonic beasts, too weak to fend for themselves, were instinctively drawn to the Blood River, throwing themselves into its depths. Over time, their remains and fluids dissolved into the water through mana, dyeing it red. Aaron's expression contorted with disgust. Her voice rose in indignation as she demanded clarification. Was he saying that the river was filled with the remnants of dead demonic beasts? Amused by her reaction, Cyan arched an eyebrow before casually adding that demonic beasts also drank and bathed in it, making the river even filthier. With a smirk, he advised her against ever considering stepping foot into its waters. Aaron shuddered in revulsion, but steadied herself with a determined breath before asking what lay at the end of the river. Cyan cast her a sidelong glance before answering nonchalantly that the river led to the demonic realm. She stiffened, her composure cracking as she repeated his words in disbelief. The demonic realm. The place where demons reside. His lips curled into a smirk as he teased that if she followed the river long enough, she might even stumble upon the Demon King himself. Aaron scoffed, regaining her composure. No sane person would ever do something that foolish. Cyan found her reaction endlessly amusing. There was something entertaining about flustering her. Before he could continue his game, a sudden crack of lightning tore through the sky. The atmosphere shifted in an instant, tension rippling through the air. Soldiers and knights turned their gazes upward, eyes widening in alarm. Startled, Aaron grabbed Cyan's sleeve and demanded to know what was happening. His playful demeanor vanished. His expression hardened as he stared in the direction of the 3rd West Sentry Post. The golden light, he murmured, signaled an encounter with a demonic beast. Aaron's breath hitched, her voice barely above a whisper as she repeated his words. A demonic beast. Across the field, the Duke's commanding voice rang out as he ordered the soldiers to protect His Majesty. His sharp gaze swept over his forces as he commanded the Knights of the Guardian Division to follow him to the 3rd West Sentry Post. The Emperor, however, remained unfazed. Instead, he let out a deep, almost amused sigh, addressing the Duke by name as he shook his head. He was disappointed. The Duke turned sharply toward him, eyes narrowing in confusion. With an easy grace, the Emperor raised a hand, and in it, an arrow gleamed with an ominous glow. He aimed it toward the Duke and smirked. Did he truly believe that this was just a simple visit? A chilling silence settled over the camp. The Emperor's gaze gleamed with something unreadable. Excitement, perhaps. This trip had been dull, he continued, his tone almost playful. He had expected a little more action. The Duke exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. They were filled with a resigned understanding. He understood. The Emperor declares that the King's army will join forces to exterminate the demonic beasts. They will not stop until every last creature has been eradicated and the raid is complete. The Duke wastes no time in issuing orders, instructing Cyan to follow them into battle. Without hesitation, Cyan accepts, fully aware that his role is about to unfold. Aren watches him closely before voicing her doubt. Can he truly fight against demonic beasts? Cyan meets her gaze and affirms that he can, though his primary role is to provide support from the rear. Then, addressing her formally as princess, he advises her to seek refuge in the garrison. Her expression darkens with frustration, and she suddenly shouts, demanding that he take her with him. Cyan falters, momentarily stunned by her outburst. Her insistence baffles him. Tears welling in her eyes, Aren argues that they are the same age, so there is no reason why she shouldn't be allowed to fight alongside him. Cyan's voice turns sharp as he reminds her that this is a battlefield, not a playground. She glares at him, her defiance unwavering. She doesn't care. No one will stop her. Irritation flaring, Cyan calls for Jurkin. The knight steps forward with unwavering composure, offering to assume the role of the royal guards and personally escort Her Highness to safety within the garrison. His tone is firm as he requests that she follow him immediately. Aren freezes, her lips parting in disbelief. She turns toward Jurkin, then back to Cyan, her fury intensifying. How dare he treat a princess this way? Cyan doesn't flinch. Instead, he grabs her wrist, his grip firm but not unkind, and forces her to look at him. His voice is edged with frustration as he reminds her that countless knights may lose their lives because of her stubbornness. In the chaos of battle, every choice could be the difference between life and death. With eyes dark and filled with danger, Cyan locks his gaze with Aren, his voice low and biting. He asks if she is truly prepared to bear the weight of countless lives lost due to her actions. Aren stands frozen, unable to reply, as tears slip from her eyes. Her silence speaks volumes. Without another word, Cyan turns and charges forward, his tone cold as he orders her to return if she's going to act like a spoiled child. There is no room for argument, only the harsh truth of the battlefield. Aren, her heart torn between fury and helplessness, watches him disappear into the fray. Her maid stands beside her, equally silent, both women lost in the storm of emotions that swirl within them. Meanwhile, the battlefield intensifies as a slime monster appears, its terrifying presence sweeping over everything in its path. The knights brace for impact, steeling themselves for the impending clash. The Duke, undeterred by the chaos, raises his sword high and shouts with commanding authority. His voice cuts through the tumult like a sharp blade, ordering the knights to fall back into formation to protect His Majesty and to obliterate the monster without hesitation. His words spur the knights into action, their determination unwavering as they charge forward, their weapons raised high. The air crackles with the promise of battle, and they charge into the fray, their resolve as unyielding as the storm itself. It was later revealed that the emperor of the Wusif Empire, Dion Sevelis, had been wed to 2 women during his reign. His first empress, Diana Quisel, a figure of grace and dignity, had tragically passed away, leaving behind a legacy of reverence. In her place, the second empress, Cassandra Nepolis, rose to prominence, wielding the true power behind the empire's throne. From his union with the late Empress Diana, the emperor had been blessed with 2 children, the first prince and the second princess. His marriage to Empress Cassandra had further expanded the royal lineage, producing the 3rd and 4th princes. However, the 5th princess, Aren Sevelis, stood apart from her siblings in both origin and status. She was the daughter of a nameless concubine, a commoner whose humble beginnings placed her far outside the gilded circle of royal blood. Though she bore the title of princess, it was a title often met with thinly veiled scorn and disdain by those who valued lineage above all else. The imperial court, with its rigid hierarchies and unyielding traditions, viewed her as an outsider, a reminder of a union that defied their expectations. Yet Arin refused to be defined by the circumstances of her birth. Despite the whispers and sidelong glances, she carried herself with a quiet determination, embodying the resilience of one who had learned to thrive in the face of adversity. As a member of the imperial family, she embraced her duties with unwavering dedication, proving herself through actions rather than words. Her days were marked by relentless study and tireless effort, as she sought to surpass not only the expectations placed upon her, but also the achievements of those around her. Arin's spirit burned brightly, a testament to her resolve to rise above the shadows of her origins and carve out her own place within the Empire's storied history. Despite her unwavering dedication, Arin's presence in the imperial court was a thorn in the side of those who resented her humble origins. Whispers of conspiracy swirled around her, and soon she found herself ensnared in a web of deceit. Accused of treason, a charge carefully crafted to strip her of honor and dignity, she was cast out from the opulent halls of the imperial palace, exiled to the fringes of the empire. Her fate took a sorrowful turn when news spread that she had perished alone on a remote island, far from the world she had once known. It was said that she succumbed to illness, her final days marked by solitude and despair. The people, ever eager to spin tales, began to refer to her as the unfortunate princess, their voices tinged with pity as they lamented her tragic end. Some speculated that she might have lived a quieter, more peaceful life had she accepted her lowly station, while others whispered that her ambition, her refusal to bow to the limitations imposed upon her, had been her undoing. To them, her downfall was a cautionary tale, a reminder that silence and obedience might have spared her such a grim fate. Kiram, her voice laced with skepticism, questioned whether this was truly the way Cyan's father had recounted the story in his previous life. Cyan, swinging his sword with an air of casual indifference, replied that things were different now. Royal politics, he explained, had a way of distorting truths, and the circumstances surrounding Arin and himself were no longer the same. After all, they shared a similar background, bound by the weight of their shared struggles. As Cyan's gaze swept across the battlefield, littered with the remains of slain slimes, creatures that resembled grotesque slugs more than anything else, he couldn't help but reflect on the Emperor's earlier display of power. The Emperor had summoned Holy Lightning, a spell of immense destructive force, and with a single, decisive strike of his sword into the earth, he had obliterated the slimes in one breathtaking motion. The memory of that moment lingered in Cyan's mind, a stark reminder of the chasm that lay between his own abilities and the overwhelming might of the Emperor. Further across the battlefield, the air crackled with energy as the Emperor unleashed his formidable power. With a commanding motion, he plunged his sword into the ground, the blade erupting with a radiant, holy light that surged with raw magical energy. His teeth clenched in concentration as he channeled more mana into the weapon, his eyes flickering with arcs of lightning that mirrored the storm he commanded. The slugs surrounding him stood no chance. Bolts of lightning rained down from above, striking the creatures with unerring precision. Their grotesque bodies convulsed before collapsing lifelessly to the ground. The battlefield momentarily illuminated by the Emperor's overwhelming display of strength. Cyan observed the scene with a mix of awe and amusement. The Emperor was widely revered as an 8-star mage, a title that spoke volumes of his mastery over magic. Cyan couldn't help but think that, had the Emperor not ascended to the throne, he might have risen to become the head of the Mage Association, a position befitting his extraordinary talents. The idea brought a wry smile to Cyan's face. To someone of the Emperor's immense power, ruling an empire seemed almost trivial, a mere diversion in the grand scheme of his capabilities. After all, for a mage of his caliber, even medium-grade demonic beasts were little more than minor nuisances, easily dispatched with a flick of his wrist. The thought lingered in Cyan's mind as he watched the Emperor's relentless onslaught, a reminder of the vast gulf that separated them. As the Emperor and the Duke sat side by side, sharing a drink, the Emperor swirled the wine in his glass, listening to the soft clink of the ice cubes. He took a sip, savoring the taste, and remarked that it had been a long time since they had shared a drink together. With a slight sigh, he added that it was rather lonely to be the only one drinking. The Duke lowered his head slightly in apology, explaining that he had imposed a personal restriction on drinking during times of war, which was why he couldn't join the Emperor in this moment. Without missing a beat, the Emperor suddenly spoke up, as though a thought had just occurred to him. Since the Duke had expressed interest in the state of affairs within the Empire, he decided to share something important. He revealed that assassination attempts targeting nobles had surged across the Empire, and the rising tension in the nation had become a genuine concern. The Duke, now fully alert, inquired whether there were any common threads between the attacks. The Emperor nodded gravely, confirming that the killings were no coincidence. The nobles targeted were all corrupt officials, individuals who had been specifically listed in the Empire's records. Additionally, witnesses reported seeing a black fog at the scenes of the murders. Turning to the Duke, the Emperor asked if this detail stirred any particular thoughts. The Duke furrowed his brow, falling silent as he processed the information. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice steady, but tinged with concern. It seemed, he said, that the followers of the Black Fog had resumed their activities. He further revealed that just the day before, he had confirmed traces of them near their base. The Emperor paused for a moment, processing the Duke's words before finally nodding in agreement. He acknowledged that the Duke's reasoning was sound, but stressed that a deeper investigation was needed to understand the full scope of the situation. As he poured himself another cup of wine, the Emperor added that while he understood the need to eliminate corrupt nobles, he could not allow such actions to escalate tensions within the Empire. After a brief silence, his expression grew more serious. He then revealed that something else had caught his attention. The Duke, sensing the shift in mood, leaned in, his curiosity piqued. With a heavy exhale, the Emperor leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as he spoke. He explained that a certain noble had been spreading rumors, dangerous rumors, that the fifth princess might be behind the recent incidents. The Duke's eyes widened in shock. His voice cracked as he demanded to know if the Emperor meant that there were attempts to implicate Princess Erin in these matters. For now, the Duke had been suppressing such claims, dismissing them as baseless nonsense. But it was clear to him that there were those who sought to use the princess for their own purposes. With a deep, almost imperceptible sigh, the Duke spoke again, his tone more personal now. As a friend, not as a subject of the Empire, he requested that should he meet an untimely death before the Emperor, he hoped that the Emperor would protect the princess in his stead. The Duke, with a deep sense of respect, assures the Emperor that he will fulfill his request, not just as his friend, but as his loyal servant. He swears to carry out the Emperor's wishes without hesitation. The Emperor expresses his gratitude for the Duke's unwavering commitment. Outside, the rain pours heavily, as Emily, with a furrowed brow, asks if that's all. Cyan, adjusting his cloak, turns to face her, wondering if she's expecting more. He asks if there's something else she needs. But Emily, growing frustrated, replies that she's referring to the princess. She questions whether Cyan truly intends to end his escort duties so abruptly. Her frustration peaks as she exclaims that at this rate, he'll never marry and will live alone for the rest of his life. With a sigh, she calls him young master and gives him a disappointed look. Cyan is left momentarily stunned, wondering if she truly believes he's treating this like some sort of romantic date. As he pulls the curtain closed, he responds dryly, stating that, regardless of her opinion, he'll leave the matter in her hands. Emily, taken aback, asks in surprise if he intends to practice today despite the torrential rain. Just as she speaks, Cyan opens the door and freezes. A cloaked figure stands in the doorway. Cyan, not initially looking up, snaps at Emily, instructing her to stop worrying about his actions and to get some rest. But when he turns back to the figure, his eyes widen in shock. Emily gasps in alarm, asking who the stranger is. The cloaked figure removes her hood, revealing Princess Erin. She looks directly at Cyan, and with a calm but firm tone, asks if he plans to go out in such weather. She gestures to her face and politely requests a conversation, her gaze steady as she waits for his response. The moment Emily recognizes Princess Erin, her eyes brighten with hope, and she eagerly rushes toward the princess, playfully pushing Cyan aside. Cyan, caught off guard, watches in disbelief. Outside, soldiers guard every tent, and as Cyan closes the curtain, Aaron, scanning the tent's interior, asks how long it's been since he arrived. Cyan replies, a hint of reluctance in his voice, that it's been about a month. Then, he asks, somewhat cautiously, why she has come to see him. Aaron turns to him, her expression unreadable, but instead of answering, she directs her attention to Emily. With a commanding tone, she asks Emily to leave them alone for a while. Cyan follows suit, also instructing Emily to step outside for a moment. Emily, flashing a mischievous grin, teasingly comments that she'll give them space to enjoy each other's company and practically skips out of the tent. Both Cyan and Erin stand in stunned silence, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Cyan sighs in exasperation, wondering why anyone would assume he would want to enjoy the company of a 10-year-old, especially when he's already 40. Before he can dwell on it further, Erin interrupts his thoughts. She turns to him, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and apologizes for her behavior earlier that day. She admits, a touch of shyness in her voice, that she didn't act in a way befitting a princess. Cyan, feeling slightly awkward himself, rubs the back of his head and assures her not to worry about it. He too feels embarrassed and regrets his own rude behavior. His response makes Erin chuckle lightly as she reassures him that it's nothing. She would have reacted the same way had she been in his shoes. She then adds, almost thoughtfully, that unlike her, he is acknowledged by those around him and far more mature. Cyan's eyes widen in surprise, realizing that there's far more depth to Erin than he had first assumed. Suddenly, Aaron smiles softly and mentions that she heard he would be joining the academy as well. She expresses her hope that they can stay on good terms, but before she can finish her thought, Cyan locks his dark red gaze on her and cuts her off. He responds coldly, saying that he can't. He doesn't believe he'll be able to offer her any help. The words hit Erin like a blow, and she stands frozen in shock. Cyan smirks and adds that if she's here to make acquaintances, she should turn back. His words seem to cut deeper than he intended. Erin's face falls, her expression turning sad. She says quietly that all she wanted was for them to get along, but his harshness is too much. Her eyes begin to glisten with unshed tears as she asks, voice trembling, if he too believes that she's only a princess in title. Cyan is silent for a long moment, the weight of her question hanging in the air. Finally, she continues, more resigned than before, acknowledging that from his point of view, she's someone with nothing to offer him. She apologizes for wasting his time, admitting that she must have misunderstood. She thought they might have had a conversation, but it's clear now that he's nothing like Lord Eschel. As she walks past him, she casually mentions his name. The sound of it hits Cyan like a thunderclap. His eyes widen and he clenches his fist, unable to process what she just said. His thoughts are racing when, without thinking, he turns sharply and grabs her wrist. Aaron tries to pull her hand away, demanding to know what's wrong with him all of a sudden. But Cyan's gaze is intense as he stares at her, shock and disbelief in his voice when he asks, "How do you know about my elder brother?" Gritting her teeth, Erin responds sharply, her anger rising. She tells him that she met his brother during a visit to the Royal Academy last year. She even recalls how his brother gave her advice, to continue behaving as a princess and not to worry too much about it. Cyan's mind races. His brother gave her advice? His confusion deepens into disbelief. That cannot be true. He knows all too well the nature of his diabolical brother. Cyan wonders if the plan to undermine Princess Erin has already begun, and the realization causes a cold fury to surge within him. Determined now, he opens his mouth to offer his own advice to her, but before he can speak, something shifts in the atmosphere. Emily bursts into the tent, panic etched on her face. She shouts urgently for them to run. Just as her words register, the roof of the tent is torn apart. Both Cyan and Erin look up in shock. Emily is thrown aside as a monstrous figure looms over them, gripping the shredded remains of the tent in its hand. A guard, shouting commands, yells to another knight to check if Cyan is all right. The chaos that follows overwhelms them both, and the looming danger becomes all too real.